Chapter 1. Pont Saint-Esprit and Avignon testify to that. Here the mariners would pray that their skill, their navigation secrets, handed down for generations, would take them past the hazards that had wrecked so many of their boats and sent countless treasures down to the bottom of the then untamable Rhone. The charm, the loveliness, the strange and indescribable luminosity of Provence and Languedoc, for Pont Saint-Esprit sits on the dividing line between the two, has been praised lyrically by troubadours. Stendhal, Dante, Petrarch, Mistral, Daudet, and others over the centuries. Pont Saint-Esprit has been called by Frédéric Mistral la Porte du Midi, the great moment in geography when the north of France dissolves into the romance and legend of the Midi, leaving the greyness of the north behind in favor of lavender, thyme, perfume, and the twisted trunks of olive trees. At Pont Saint-Esprit also, the ranges of the Massif Central begin to give way to the more gentle Cevennes, and the tunnels off shade provided by the plane trees in the village are said to be enough to combat the broiling sun of the long summer months. Say La Porte Sainte, La Porte Triomphale de l'Arte d'Amour, wrote Mistral of Pont Saint-Esprit, forgetting in his enthusiasm the more bloody struggles of history played in this theatre. From her pedestal near the Rhone, the Virgin statue, whole or wounded, looks out on both the exuberant view reflected by Mistral and the ghost images of the sanguine combats of the past. Not far away, the first big battle between the Romans and the Celts took place. Part of Hannibal's army plundered through the region on its way to Rome in 218 BC, and the army of Bituit crossed the Rhine on a bridge of boats at the place where Pont Saint-Esprit stands today. The Middle Ages brought no rest from turbulence. 10,000 Saracens were finally slaughtered nearby by Charles Martel in the 9th century. At that time, it was known as Saint-Saturnin-du-Port, and by 1164 the port was able to enjoy the spate of prosperity that lasted until Raymond VII sacked the town in 12309. By the beginning of the 14th century, the town was walled and fortified, and the bridge, many thought it was a religious miracle, was built across half a mile of untamed Rhine, with 22 arches. The towers on each end held a garrison of 300 men, and from that moment on, no military operation would be carried out in the Rhine Valley that failed to involve Saint-Saturnin. This was hardly a blessing, since the town went through a nightmare occupation by the routiers, involving the usual consequences of rape, murder, and pillage. In May of 1951, after the storm that ripped the arm from the Virgin statue, the town and the valley bathed in the utter loveliness of the Midi springtime. The trim and manicured vines, born in Roman times and neighbors to the courtly Châteauneuf Neuf du Pape vineyards, the cypress trees, the myrtle, the peach blossoms, the lavender, could wipe out the memory of all the great historic hardship and even the misfortune that had struck the Madonna. During the days that followed, the townspeople and les cultivateurs would look up to the statue from great distances with regret. But there was work to do in the vineyards, and the merchants of Pont Saint-Esprit were beginning to feel the growing pains brought on by the construction of the Donzère Mondragondum and power plants, which with the Centre d'Energie Atomique some 10 kilometers below, would begin to change the medieval face of the countryside for miles around. But some of the faithful could not forget the incident of the Virgin statue so quickly. Even as the workmen began to repair it, they thought of the last time. The storm had wrecked her stateliness, when the tragedy of the Second World War had followed so brusquely. Could the new distress of the statue be another omen that a tragedy was about to strike? Many talked about it in the marketplace the following Saturday morning, where by habit and tradition the stalls are set up each week under the plane trees along the Boulevard Gambetta and Boulevard Carnot. At the weekly market a bewildering variety of wares is displayed. Here the villagers buy trinkets, haberdashery, geraniums and begonias, hardware, fruits and vegetables, spices and poultry, and even tractors. The market is the focal event of the week at Pont Saint-Esprit, as it is all throughout Provence and Languedoc. It creates a scene of monumental gossip sessions embracing the latest scandal jokes and family news. At these moments the town becomes agent, interrelated, an animated family, before the people return with overloaded baskets to the narrow, twisted streets of the inner Scient town, where even a Dux Chivos citrine must brush the skirts of a passerby before it can get through the village. On one of these streets, the Rue des Quatre Coins, lived Mademoiselle Francine Rabassa, who, returning from the market that morning, pondered over the talk of the broken arm of the Madonna. She was religious, a good Catholic, but certainly not fanatic or superstitious. She did not believe in omens, or live by them. The suggestion, however, planted in her mind by the market gossip, continued to plague her for several days. She worked during the week on the Boulevard Gambetta at the combined home and office of M. and Mme. Aynard, a young husband and wife who had brought skilled and modern dentistry to the town, which was desperately in need of it. "You know," she said one morning to Madame Aynard, who helped her husband in his practice only occasionally during this time because of their small daughter and a child she was carrying, "I do not like to think that I am superstitious. But this story of the arm falling off the statue of the Madonna keeps going through me mind. Why does it bother you so much?" Mme. Aynard asked. "They say in the village that it is an omen," Francine said. "A very bad omen." "I wouldn't pay much attention to that," Mme. Aynard said. "People are always going around trying to create ugly omens out of everything." Madame Aynard was a pragmatist, knowledgeable in the ways of the outside modern world. She was kind and sympathetic and well loved throughout the village, both as a dentist and as a person. "The rumors are so persistent," Francine continued. "Some even say that they knew the arm was going to fall off before it happened." Mme. Aynard laughed. "Some people claim to know everything before it happens. I usually find we don't have to pay much attention to them." "The last time it happened," Francine said, "was on the eve of the Second World War. And that came about especially in this town." She was referring to the occupation by the Waffen SS when the Nazis converted the ancient underground citadel on the banks of the Rhine to interrogate and slaughter over 4,000 members of the resistance from all around the region. They would, conveniently, dump the bodies in the Rhine. This and the bombardment by the Allies on August 15, 1944, had left fresh scars on the town to add to those left by the violence of the Middle Ages. "We have had much tragedy here," Mme. Aynard said. As an amateur historian, she knew this well. She was later to plan a campaign to restore as historic monuments the citadel and the unique Église collégiale du Plan, the 1319 cathedral deep underground beside the citadel, with its sculptured doorway built by Louis XI. "But perhaps now we'll be able to live in peace and help our town grow well again." "Perhaps," said Francine. "I do hope so. We have had enough trouble." "We have," said Madame Aynard. "Enough to think that maybe we'll deserve better times." "Well," said Francine, "I'm going to forget about it. I just wanted to get it off my mind." She did forget, and so did Madame Aynard. The Mistral, the wind, not the poet, stopped its cruel whiplashing of the valley for the summer months. The courtyards in the bent streets blossomed with roses and wisteria, and the romantic aura of Daudits-Provence took over the spirits of the people. Theodec and Rhine Nevis gave over their trout and shad to the fishermen, the Ardoc also offering clear and sparkling refreshment to the swimmers of the town. For the more adventurous, the Mediterranean lay only 2 hours away. By the time August arrived, the hunters, intent on rabbit and thrush, were wiping down the barrels of their shark guns in anticipation of the coming hunting season, as the townspeople prepared for the yearly fete. The high mark of the year each September.it was during these joyous summer days of 1951, on July 18, that wagon number 7.382.682 of the Société Nationale Chemin de Fer, the railroad better known as the SNCF, left the station at Chauvigny, some 300 miles to the northeast of Pont-Saint-Esprit. The freight car included in its load 10 quintals of flour, a quintal being a sack weighing 100 kilograms. This flour would find its way to the bakeries of Pont-Saint-Esprit several weeks later, by way of Bagnères-sur-Cèze, the distribution center for the region. It was the first of several loads of flour to leave Chauvigny that month, and although no one knew it at the time, this small and routine event would shatter the peace of the village of Pont-Saint-Esprit for years to come. Bread in France is more than the staff of life, it is a way of life. It is said that when the boulanger closes his shop, the village is doomed forever. In the Midi, the occasional ghost villages perched on mountaintops mark the beginning of their ends by the quiet retreat of the baker, his family, and his household goods to the more acceptable commerce of the valley towns. In every French village, in the grey, sullen morning, or the bright and bustling noon hour, or when night approaches, the townspeople file in and out of the bakery carrying the crusty brown fitites, baguettes, and gross pains under their arms, often like cordwood when the size of the family demands it. To buy wrapped bread, pain de mier, or any bread far in advance of the meal is offensive to the sensitivity of the French. Fresh bread, straight from the oven, is a ritual, the bakeshop a shrine. The villages in the constellation surrounding Pont Saint-Esprit are no exception. With the heady and sometimes quarrelsome Tavel wine of the region, or the bracing Cites du Rhône from nearby, the bread is an ideal companion to the rich southern meals. Off the Midi south of Pont Saint-Esprit by some 20 kilometers is the village of Canot, a tiny maze of stone houses squeezed together in random pattern, the twisted streets designed, so they say, to break the power of the Mistral as it sweeps down valley from the Massif Central and the Alps. There are 22 telephones in Canot, representing one doctor, the cave cooperative of the wine growers, an electrician plumber, a notary, 2 garages, a mason, la mairie, or town hall, a woodworker, and in the year 1951, 2 boulangerie pâtisserie shops, one belonging to Monsieur Monier, the other to Monsieur Griotti. On August 5, 1951, M. Monier found himself working especially hard because of La Fête Votive in the village, a festival marked with as much enthusiasm as the Fête du Premier de Septembre, which was to take place in a few weeks in the streets off neighboring Pont Saint-Esprit. But tempering his enjoyment of the festival, as M. Monier labored in his bakeshop, was the fact that he was having extreme difficulty working the batter for the bread, in which he took some pride. The problem seemed to lie in the flour shipped to him by the Union Meunier, the giant distribution organization of France that supplies flour to the bakers through its distributors at strategically located centers throughout the country. It is not onion in the labor sense of the word. As a state-supervised private monopoly, its responsibilities are well defined, and its distribution is patterned so that if one department, as the regional sections of France are called, is lacking in flour, another will provide what is necessary to keep the distribution on an even keel. The flour that caused him so much trouble that night of August 5 came from a miller unknown to him, far to the north, and what distressed M. Monier so much was that it was greyish in color, somewhat sticky, with an oilish texture which gave no promise of creating the rich and tasty bread he liked to deliver to his clients. He was able to meet his quota that night by mixing the flour with that of another sack from the nearby Vaucluse. Although the batter still did not shape to his artisan requirements, the bread rose and baked to a crisp brown turn, and its flavor met the requirements of his discerning tongue. He fumed, as other bakers were doing, at the lack of freedom to choose the source of his flour because of the rigid regulations imposed by the Union Meunier's control of the distribution. There was no choice, and the baker had to accept what he received. To reject a shipment of flour was tantamount to closing down the shop for several days in the hope it could be proved that his instinctual evaluation of the flour could stand up against the appraisal of the chemists assigned to check it. That same night, in Canot, the baker Griotti was having his own problems with the batter made from the flour of M. Maillet, who was the miller from the north supplying the region at that time. Like his confrere, M. Griotti found that he could work the dough only by mixing it with a flour from a neighboring region, and he barely managed to turn out his product for the heavy Monday morning trade through this device. By Monday afternoon both M. Monier and M. Griotti began to receive visitors in their respective boulangeries. They were the regular customers of the day before, and their complaints were nearly identical: violent colic after eating the bread. By evening M. Niotti, his wife, and his 6-year-old daughter were stricken, as well as the other members of his family in the household. They suffered not only from colic, but from diarrhea, and eruptions of a roche over the skin. M. Griotti went immediately to the café, the heart and center of every French village, where he discovered more of his clients who were ill, and learned also that several clients of M. Monier had registered the same complaints. he continued on quickly to his confrere's establishment, where both of them decided to set aside the suspect flour immediately and lodge a strong protest with the Union Meunier. They did, each of them writing to the organization's headquarters for the Departement du Gard in nearby Nimes. They were morally supported by the secretary of the Bakers' Association of Gard, who happened to be in Cano for the votive festival. By Wednesday, August 8, they were assured by the director of the Union Meunier in Nimes that their complaints would be taken care of by M. Bousquet, the local distributor who operated out of Bagnères-sur-Cèze, halfway between Cano and Pont-Saint-Esprit. M. Jean Bousquet, since 1944 le répartiteur des farines, or distributor, in the area, was having more troubles than the Canours boulangers. Practically every baker in the region who had received shipments of flour coming from the Maillet mill in the north was protesting vigorously about the quality. In the village of Saint-Genis-de-Camolles, the local baker became so distressed he called the mayor of the town to his shop to show him the flour. The dough formed from it was greasy, slimy, and grey, and the mayor immediately forbade the baker to use it, lodging his own protest with M. Bousquet as well as with the préfet of the department. On August 9, M. Bousquet sat down to might in urgency to his superiors in the Union Meunier office at Nimes. Nous vous signalons des toutes fins utiles que presque tous les boulangers du centre de Bagnères se plaignent de la qualité des farines qui sont en provenance de M. Maillet, he wrote, pointing out sharply that nearly all his clients were grumbling about the flour coming from the one mill and that action needed to be taken, while waiting for action from the flour monopoly, which seemed remarkably slow in arriving. M. Bousquet continued to dole out his supplies, rationing the flour of the Maillet mill with other stock from a different region. By contract, the union authorities must immediately take 5 samples of any flour, about which complaints are made, to be analyzed. No provisions in the cumbersome mechanics of distribution had been made about what the bakers should do in the interim. They in turn were not allowed to shut down without express permission. Further, the grain did not seem seriously defective. The problem seemed to be mainly a question of a temporary bread supply of slightly inferior quality. There seemed to be no threat of further illnesses, which had died off after the initial flurry in Cano. One strange symptom did, however, continue. The family of M. Griotti discovered that they had difficulty getting to sleep, and this condition lasted for several days. A further complication plagued the bakers of the area in that the lumbering distribution system made it impossible for them to refuse delivery of the flour, their only night being to notify the union of any problems with the supplies. After several telephone calls to the flour monopoly at Nimes, M. Bousquet's patience began to wear thin, along with the nerves of his clients, who continued to protest to him. He wrote again to the Union Municher on August 11, demanding immediate instructions. He received none. By August 13, a group of bakers from the towns around gathered in his office to threaten severe action if the union did not respond to their complaints. At 11 o'clock that morning, M. Bousquet called directly to the union headquarters at Nimes in the presence of the angry bakers. He was assured politely that someone would be around to gather the necessary samples. The bakers, temporarily mollified, went back to their shops to work with the material they had on hand. M. Bousquet, bristling under both the delays of the Union Meunier and the pressure from the bakers, faced frustration in any direction he looked. At the end of the unwelcome conference, he wrote again to headquarters, his anger bursting through the usual reserve he employed in his letters. En vous demandant DCEQ de tout urgence des prelevements des, he wrote, referring to the urgency of at least taking the samples of the flour, if nothing else. By Friday, August 17, his patience was obliterated as the mayor of Saint-Genis-de-Camolles arrived at his office to warn him that unless the Union Meunier took immediate action, the mayor would organize every town in the vicinity to demand action. For the 4th time, M. Bousquet sat down at his desk to write the union, this time with the despair and exhaustion that can only come from dealing with the impossible phantom created by impersonal organization. But even as he wrote the letter, the germination of one of the strangest, most inexplicable tragedies of modern medical history had already been set in motion, and nothing that M. Bousquet or the Union Meunier might now do could stop it. For that matter, nothing in known modern medical practice could combat it. On the road north from Bagnales toward Pont Saint-Esprit, over the crest of the last hill, the plains of the Rhône sprawl out in a magnificent vista, with the rust-red rooftops of the village marking the random, crooked lines of the streets and alleys which defy geometry. While the ramparts are no longer surrounding the town, the demarcation lines are still visible, as if the turrets, with thierpikemen and crossbowmen, were still there in ghost image. Above the town, the tower of the 15th-century Église Saint-Saturnin surveys the tile roofs with a placid acceptance of all the indignities history has brought to the village. In the bright morning sunlight off the Midi, the winding streets and oddly pitched roofs take on the aspect of the illustrations of a fairy tale book. Over many streets and ways are ancient arches, with the alleys snaking under them to become lost in the rest of the maze. A stranger in the center of the old town can lose his way in moments in the unpredictable turnings of the streets. For even a medium-sized American automobile, the ways are impassable along the new concrete dikes of the Rhine banks. The ancient houses show their backs to the river. At one time during the Middle Ages, their windows were walled in to become part of the fortress against the marauding routiers. The bridge at Pont Saint-Esprit is the pride of both the town and history. Its more famous sister bridge, 40 kilometers Balouot-Avignon, has not stood the test of posterity as well. Only a fragment remains of the latter, under which they used to dance on the grassy island in the Rhône, rather than on the bridge itself, Athsong suggests. At the second half of the 13th century, les Frères Pontifes were invited by Pont Saint-Esprit to duplicate their miraculous work at Avignon. In spite of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the new bridge took from 1265 to 1309 to complete. Today, the ancient stone arches of the bridge support the rumbling tracks and traffic of Route Nationale 94, just as they did the wagons and carts of the Middle Ages. At the Pont Saint-Esprit end of the bridge, only the stately Maison du Roi, where 12 different kings of France were received, remains above ground. To mark the entrance to the town, bending through the old village, from the Place de la République to the Place de Hôtel de Ville, is the narrow street known as Grande Rue. Its width, barely enough to permit 4 people to pass, and its total lack of sidewalks belie its name. Yet it is an important street for both its merchants and its residents. It is, in a sense, the gravitational center of town, even if it does lack the all-important cafes that find more room for their sprawling outdoor tables under the plane trees of the boulevards Gambetta and Carnet. There are almost no phones on Grande Rue, even among the commercial establishments. Perhaps it is because the tight compression of the streets and the medieval houses make it possible to talk face-to-face across the window sills or from the doorways, and sooner or later everyone in the village is likely to find himself in the Grande Rue at one time or another during the week. The race on the street, nearly all that human needs might demand, a drogery for hardware, paints, tools, nails, glue, sandpaper, toothpaste, eau-cedar mops, shaving cream, and toilet needs, a fleurist for the absolute necessity of pleasing the aesthetic taste of the French, a seed store, to supply the means to grow a village's own flowers, a boucherie charcuterique, where sausages and the best French cuts of meats may be had, a pharmacy, strictly for medicines of any type, whether they are prescribed or not, and without the soda fountain or extras, électricité générale, including wiring, lamp fixtures, television, radio, and light bulbs, une boutique des vêtements, with clothing for infants, and a chemisserie and bonneterie for adults, a poissonnerie, for fish and sea food, raw materials for the popular Provençal bouillabaisse, and alimentation, for foods and vin current, and, of course, the boulangerie and pâtisserie, the most frequented shops on any street. In August of 1951, the most popular baker on the Grande Rue was Roche Briand. Powerful, tall, athletic, in his 40s, he served his clients well, priding himself in the rich, golden loaves he stacked on end each day behind his counter, taking equal pride in the brioches and croissants he baked. He was known among the residents of Grande Rue to go out of his way to help a client who needed information in the more complex things of the outside world, such as tax information, insurance data, or minor legal problems, since Pont Saint-Esprit did not have the luxury of a full-time lawyer or avocat. Part of his time, as a matter of fact, was devoted to insurance work. For 30 years his bakery had served the town well, and many claimed his bread was the best in the region. Since 1925 he had been married to Marie Jean, and he had 2 daughters and 2 sons ranging from 23 to even. In September of 1939 he had joined des Troupes Coloniales in Marseilles, and spent 13 months of his service in Syria during the time that M. Bousquet was doling out and rationing the questionable flour from the north. M. Briand and the other bakers of Pont Saint-Esprit added their protests against the quality to the general chorus in the region. The vague and unconfirmed explanation going around seemed to be that this was the time of the year when the farmers were reaching the bottom of their silos, where the grain had been sitting for many months, and that when the new harvests came in from the fields, the situation would be relieved. Meanwhile, the greyish flour seemed to rise well, and there were no complaints about the taste. The brief flurry of illnesses at Cano could have been the result of anything. With the hope that samples would immediately be lifted by the Union Meunier, the bakers had no choice but to continue blending the grey flour with their better stocks. On Thursday, August 9, 1951, M. Bousquet squeezed his truck into Grande Rue at 10 o'clock in the morning to supply M. Briand with 7 sacks of flour from the mill of M. Amaye and 8 from another mill. He continued his rounds at Pont Saint-Esprit, delivering the same amounts to 2 other bakers of the village. M. Briand was ready with his protests as the delivery arrived, pointing out that the flour from M. Amaye's mill was certainly not of first quality and that something had to be done about it. He was perhaps more acutely aware than most bakers of the futility of his protest, because several years before he had refused to utilize a shipment of flour of obviously bad quality, and the prefecture had closed his shop down for a month. On the following day, Friday, a fellow baker in the village, Mosso Benjamin Jaucent, called at M. Briand's shop to see if he could borrow 2 100-kilo sacks of flour. Borrowing flour was a common practice among the bakers, especially since the Union Meunier demanded cash on delivery, and no longer extended a 30-day billing period so the bakers could keep stock on hand and pay for it at the end of the month. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening, and M. Briand was busy, as was his custom at this time, with the ovens. He gave M. Jaucent the key to the storeroom and told him to help himself. M. Jaucent did not begin to work the borrowed flour until Saturday evening, the 11th of August. As he began to work it, he thought that it smelled faintly of fuel oil. But other than that, the flour was acceptable enough and compared favorably with the other stock he had on hand. He prepared only 1 petite fournie or baking that night, enough to supply Mme Colonna with bread for sandwiches at her refreshment stand at Pont d'Ardac, and a few other loaves for his own use at his own table that night, and later on Sunday, M. Jaucent and his family ate the bread and enjoyed it. It was not until late Sunday evening that his 11-year-old son complained of feeling extremely cold in his hands and feet and later vomited considerably. On Monday morning his 13-year-old son and daughter began to have the same symptoms, as well as his wife. All broke out with a slight rash on their skins. By Wednesday M. Jaucent had joined them and was forced to go to bed for several days later. He learned that some of his clients complained of the same troubles. But the complaints, generally, were mild, and no one associated them directly with the bread. The news of the other malades from Cano had not reached Pont Saint-Esprit at that time, and the mild attacks were accepted with Gallic resignation. On the evening of Wednesday, August 15, M. Briand stopped by the shop of M. Jaucent to see if the borrowed flour could be returned. He was greeted by M. Jaucent's father-in-law, who told Briand that Jaucent was not feeling too well, and was confined to his bed. However, it was perfectly all night for M. Briand to reclaim at least 1 sack of flour due him, and if he would send his helper, it would be immediately available. By 8:30 in the evening, M. Pradier, M. Briand's helper, or matron, had returned with the sack. M. Briand and Pradier began to prepare 3 different batches of bread that night and morning. The first was out of the oven by 3 in the morning, and consisted of the flour Briand already had on hand. The second baking was not completed until about 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, and was made from a mixture of the original flour and that taken back from M. Jaucent. Because of minor holidays at this time in August, the distribution center was closed, and M. Bryant found that he had to borrow a second and third sack from 2 other local bakers that night. It was not until noon on Thursday, August 16th, that the third and last baking was completed. Most of the flour he was forced to use that night came from the mill of M. Amaye. M. Bryant was not pleased with it. As he worked the dough, he noticed that it was slightly gray, but certainly no more so than the general supply that all the bakers were receiving. He tasted it several times to find it acceptable, if not equally as good as the normal flour received during the better seasons. He nevertheless resolved to lodge another protest, stronger this time, when the distribution center opened Friday morning, and then he went on with his work. By 9 o'clock Thursday morning, August 16th, M. Bryant was able to rest long enough to take a light meal on the counter of his shop. The bread was fresh, but no longer warm. The crust was crisp, and of the usual golden brown color. Its taste, to M. Bryant's expert tongue, was good. Behind him the long, thin baguettes, the gross panes, larger and thicker, the flutes, middle-sized, were stacked like soldiers at attention on the shelves. Night had run out, and already the first clients were beginning to arrive. One by one the shutters along Grande Rue were beginning to open. The sun of the midi, already warm, was promising to broil later in the day. To the villagers, to the farmers nearby, to the workers in the vineyards, it was just another hot Languedoc-Provençal day. No one was prepared for what was going to happen. No one could be expected to be. By 10 o'clock that Thursday morning all the shops along Grande Rue were welcoming their customers, the stone houses along the pavementless street giving some welcome shade from the August sun. Under the plane trees, some distance away, the bull players were gathered, most of them the older men of the village, already pensioned, with their retirement assured by the state. Their passion for bull was equalled only by their fondness for a milky glass of water and pastis, the aniseed alcohol drink so popular in Provence. The sandy gravel strip that divides the Boulevard Carnot from the Rue de la Liberté served as the playing ground for the players, clustered in several groups along the strip. One by one they would toss out the small wooden target ball, le bouchon as it is called. And one by one, the players would throw the heavy metal balls, about the size and weight of ancient cannonballs, and try to land nearer to the target than the others. Through it all, the groans and cheers of the spectators continued. Occasionally a player would wander away to the tobacco for a package of Gallus cigarettes, puffing a wreath of the sour smoke as he returned. The workers in the village factory, which made the bottles for the sparkling Perrier water, by custom would be glancing at the clock to count off the moments until the long midday siesta. As in most of France, they would return to their homes for a sizable dinner in spite of the heat. But this day was different. They were out on strike, and dispersed among the bull players or off fishing to mark time until the strike was settled. At the village washing place, along the edge of the Rhine, the women were beating their laundry on the broad stone rim, chattering among themselves as their predecessors had done for centuries. The fresh, bright spring water ran freely through the large rectangular tanks of the municipal wash basins, just as it gushed from the gargoyles of the Fontaine de la Navigation and the swans of the Fontaine du Coq. Even the few women who had washing machines at times preferred to gather at the basin to rinse their wash, for there was much to talk about, especially the coming fête du 1er de September, only 15 days away. At the Café de la Bourse and the Café des Voyageurs, the sidewalk tables had already attracted their habitués, some of them sipping the bitter café filter, leavened by a sugar cube, some already getting a head start with a glass of pastis. Stone streets everywhere were hot, and no breeze was stirring to lighten the burden of the spirit pantons, as the villagers call themselves. Some housewives were shopping, and shopping is a serious business. They are immersed in their families, and to keep them clean and well-fed is the limited dream of their lives. On this morning, as on any other morning, the spirit ponton wives could be seen walking through the crooked streets with empty wine casks to fulfill their obligations as they gained the pleasure of the local news and gossip. They would be searching for arachide oil rather than the insalubrious butter of the north, and while d'olive for the sauces for salads and the traditional garlic soup. Here they would be boiling the garlic cloves in water, adding Gruyere cheese and cubes of toasted bread to soothe the overheated nerves of their husbands as they returned from the shops or vineyards at noontime. In the houses, the cool stone walls would be keeping the heat to a bearable level, while the wives would use their artistry with herbs and vin current to convert a cheap cut of meat into a lordly meal. White wine to glorify the rabbit, red with other meats, along with thyme and bay leaves and whole cloves. On this morning, as on others, the alimentation shops remained Aladdin's caves for the fruit and vegetable shoppers, always demanding fresh greens for the midday repast or any other meal. At the charcuterie, the sausages, hams, saucissons, pdts, black pudding, and caillettes, small balls of mincemeat mixed with local grasses, were forcing the wives into agonizing decisions, tempered by the fact that regardless of the choice of meat, there was always the goat's cheese, wrapped in green leaves, to counterbalance any temporary dislike of the main viand and, of course, the boulangerie. By 10 that morning, the loaves off the first fournie, or baking, were almost gone from the shelves of M. Bryand. Ame Pradier, the 18-year-old helper of Bryand, had completed most of his chores, and had sat down for a moment to enjoy his petit déjeuner, including several generous slices from the second baking. By midday he joined his patron and family in their apartment adjoining the shop to eat his lunch, and the bread still hot from the ovens of the third scheduled baking-off day. The headlines of the day were to be strangely familiar 15 years later, though few in Pont-Saint-Esprit would be reading them. China was claiming total equality with the Soviet Union and Mao was taking severe umbrage at the Soviets. The struggle in Vietnam was bitter and endless, but it was the French, of course, and not the United States, at that time. Only a few days before, a French general had been killed by a terrorist grenade in South Vietnam. The usual soccer and rugby matches between the villages were being played, and of course the bloody automobile accidents of the day were announced in screaming headlines. On this morning, Mme Aynard had more than usual to do, and rose early to get a head start on the day. There were the children to take care of, the household to supervise, and breakfast to prepare for her husband before he went to his cabinet to prepare for the long list of dental appointments for the day. In fact, the appointment schedule was so overcrowded that for the first time in several months, Mme Aynard was planning to come in and assist with the dentistry to relieve some of the load from her husband. By the time Francine arrived to help with the house hold, Mme Aynard was already behind schedule. She had planned to do her shopping before going to help her husband, including a visit to M. Bryand's bakery on Grande Rue, which was in the same quartier of the village. I'm afraid I'm terribly late this morning, she told Francine. If you would, I'd like you to do the shopping for the food and bread for me. She went over the list with Francine, gave her the purse and shopping basket, and rushed off to join her husband at their offices. Francine, who patronized a different baker from M. Brand, went by habit to get the bread at her usual shop, not dreaming for a moment the significance of her act. On the way, however, she met her sister, Mme Charpale, returning from the shop of M. Bryand, and Francine regretted she had not bought the bread there because her sister told her that M. Bryand was giving free bread to those workers who at the moment were out on strike at the factory. A baker who supported the workers should get her support, Francine thought. After all, her sister was one of the workers. Mme Charpale said goodbye to Francine and returned to her home on the Rue des Quatre Coins to enjoy a mid-morning snack of bread and coffee. She had a passion for fresh bread, and her time off from the factory gave her an opportunity to eat some this morning, more oven fresh than usual. Beside her in the cradle, her 9-month-old baby girl gurgled peacefully. Over 300 people in the village bought their bread that day at M. Bryand's shop. M. Carl, whose grocery shop was considered by many to be the finest in town, sent his maid to bring back 3 loaves for lunch and dinner that day, although usually he patronized another baker, whose shop was closed for the holidays. M. Sauvé, a garage man in the village, also patronized another baker, but today M. Carl's small daughter volunteered to go to the store for him and his wife, and finding their customary bakery closed, brought back 2 loaves of bread from M. Bryand. There were others who bought their bread from M. Bryand who never had before. There were some who, by fate or accident, bought their bread this day from another boulangerie, although they had patronized M. Bryant on every other day. Mme. Paul Ryu dropped by the shop of M. Bryant in the late morning. She and her husband were fond of the bread Bryant had been baking so many years in the town, and she exchanged pleasantries with Mme. Bryant, who helped behind the counter during the busy times of the day, as well as their daughter Yvonne. All through the day the front door opened and closed endlessly. The clients came not from Pont-Saint-Esprit alone, but from many off-surrounding villages, from Saint-Julien-de-Pérolas, from the Route d'Ardoc, from Carsan, from St. Paul at de Cassoun, from St. Alexandre. There was Joseph Pouchet, the ex-pilot, and Louis Guigou, the garagist, and Mme. Boudin, wife of the genial proprietor of the local hat and sporting goods store, Marcel Boudin. On the Grande Rue the neighbors filed in and out with brief but newsy exchanges of greetings: Mme. Braric, Mme. Chambon, Marie Baverel, Jean Crebier, Blanche Morgan, Mme. Payan, and Hélène Charrier, wife of the pharmacist on the street. Carefully, they would choose the loaves of their liking, whether flute, baguette, or grosse pain, marching out on the hot street with their unwrapped bread under their arms or strapped across the back of a bicycle. At noon on that day, Marcel Delacroix was at work at his desk at the Coopérative des Céréales de Pont-Saint-Esprit. As manager of the organization, his days were filled with the endless details of receiving and shipping grain and fertilizers for the farmers in the region, and he almost forgot that he had promised to bring the bread back to Mme. Testevin at the villa where he was a pensionaire, or boarder. Shortly after 12 he stopped his dictation to Mademoiselle Wulschlager, his secretary, and dismissed her with apologies for running over into the lunch hour. M. Delacroix was a precise and intelligent man, an artist and poet of measurable talent as well as a man of commerce. Some of his poems had appeared in a national anthology of French poets. He did not like to impose on those who worked for him, and his sensitivity and consideration was marked and admired by all who had dealings with him. As a Parisian with considerable travel and work abroad, he was somewhat of an anomaly in Pont-Saint-Esprit. But his quiet, self-effacing demeanor enabled him to blend into the customs of the village soundlessly. After serving in World War I, he had become a sales representative in Argentina, and worked in that area for several different French companies, whose products included school supplies, lace, religious art, and gloves. It was his health that had prompted him to give up a life of travel and the pressures of Paris to retire to less demanding work in the Provençal atmosphere. His accommodations at La Villette, the large farmhouse of the Testevin family, enabled him to enjoy the country air yet still remain within a kilometre of his office in the village. He had a large bedroom in one corner of the villa, looking out on the courtyard and the vineyards beyond. The room was furnished modestly in French provincial style, and the rich red tile floor was cooling in the heat of the summer days. On the walls he had hung a few office paintings, soft, sensitive oils of the surrounding countryside in subdued and restrained colors. As in all the other rooms in La Villette, a crucifix hung on the wall. After straightening up his desk, he locked the office door for the long 2-hour midday siesta and pedaled off on his bicycle down the Rue de Ouest and along the Boulevard Gambetta. Turning into Grande Rue and proceeding to the shop of M. Bryant, he parked his bicycle outside and entered to greet Mme. Bryant, who was behind the counter. After an exchange of pleasantries he asked for 2 grosse pains, loaves weighing about a kilo each, a little over 2 pounds. Mme. Bryant did not have any left on the shelves and went to the back of the store to get them. She returned promptly with the 2 loaves and passed them across the counter to him. He paid the money, 50 old francs, and went out to put them into the sack tied to his bicycle. One reason he preferred to buy his bread from M. Bryant was that the baker supplied him with a special sack for his bicycle. He pedaled slowly back along Grande Rue, which by now was nearly deserted, for the shops were closed and the villagers had retreated to their houses for the almost sacred midday repast. La Villette, a stone and plaster Mars, as a large farmhouse is called in the Midi, rests on a high hill overlooking Pont-Saint-Esprit. A long stone work shed extends out from one side of the house, and an ornate iron gate marks the entrance. One side without windows faces the direction of the Mistral, which blows and screeches during the fall, winter, and spring months and at times frays the nerves of everyone. Mme Testevin took in selected boarders, mothered them, and fed them with lavish attention. At that time in 1951 the house was not as famous as later, when it came to be known as the birthplace of Jacqueline Kennedy's great-grandfather. Later, all of Pont-Saint-Esprit would bathe in the reflected fame of the Bouvier family, after Jacqueline Kennedy became the First Lady of the White House. Mme Testevin, proud to be a cousin of the Bouvier family, not only managed the full household, but helped her husband with the vineyards, took care of the laundry, and grew many of her own herbs and vegetables. M. Testevin, a ruddy, lean, and tall farmer in his 50s, tended 25,000 vines with care and passion and produced 80,000 litres of wine each year. M. Delacroix, puffing up the hill of his bicycle, reached Mme Testevin's kitchen barely in time for the luncheon ritual. At the asterisk table was the usual group found these days at La Villette. M. Testevin was at the head of the long farmhouse table, Mme Testevin at the other end, near the kitchen. On one side, with their backs to the window, sat Émile Cima, a genial Italian worker in the vineyards, a man strong as an ox but soft in manner, and M. Delacroix, the slim and soft-mannered Parisian. Opposite them sat Mme Desertes, a gentle lady living at the farm-inth room next to the Testevin quarters. The men, freshly in from the vineyards, ate heartily of the pot-au-feu, the thick vegetable soup with large chunks of beef in which Mme Testevin prided herself. The others ate less avariciously, but savoured the flavour, for it was good. The large carafes of red and rose wine came from their own vineyards, and each helped himself freely, under M. Testevin's urging. Nearly all enjoyed the Provençal custom of dipping large chunks of bread in the stew, and the meal was finished off with goat's cheese, gruyere, and a heaping bowl of fruit. The conversation was light and pleasant, for this was a genteel group, courteous, and sensitive to the needs of the others. Scores of other tables in or near the village of Pont-Saint-Esprit were served with much the same type of meal, with minor variations. In other homes there were eggs soufflé, or salade niçoise, or omelettes auxiliary fines herbs, or potage de légumes, or biftec, or thrush liver, known as pdte de grives. Whatever the course, the bread played a large part of the meal. No one at any table in the region that day made any complaint about the taste of M. Brian's bread. M. Delacroix, more used to the whiteness of Parisian bread, felt that it was perhaps a little grey in colour, but the flavour was good. Émile, robust and tanned from the vineyards, ate more heartily than the others, for his appetite matched his strength. M. Testevin, too, ate heavily to fortify himself against the long, hot afternoon. Mme Testevin ate only a slice no bigger than her little finger. By 1:45 in the afternoon the group had dispersed, content with the repast. Mme Testevin cleared the table, Mme Desertes retired to her room. Émile and M. Testevin excused themselves and moved out into the vineyards, which were within weeks of being harvested. M. Delacroix mounted his bicycle again and coasted off toward his office in the village. For all at this table, and for the others in the area, another ordinary summer midday meal had come to an end shortly after the noon hour had begun. M. Brian prepared, as was his custom, to make his delivery rounds in the surrounding countryside. He gathered his loaves together, for there were several large domains in the outlying section with working crews and large families who counted on his deliveries. Among them were the Moulin and Mison families, living out in the country near Carson. The domain of Joseph Moulin was particularly far out, and the baker left his loaves for the Moulins at a neighboring farm. After several other deliveries he returned to his shop to prepare, as usual, for the bakings the next day, Fin de Way, August 17. He had not been back in the shop more than an hour or so before Félix Mison, the farmer from Carson, entered to chide him mildly for forgetting to drop off his customary order of bread. M. Brian suddenly realized he had forgotten the delivery and quickly apologized. M. Mison accepted the apologies in good humor, paid for the bread, and left the shop. Once again Bryant and the village itself settled down to its usual midweek routine. On his vacation in the Pyrenees, some 500 miles away, Dr. Albert Gabbai, one of the 3 physicians in Pont-Saint-Esprit, was facing an entirely different type of weather on that day: rain. In fact, it had rained almost constantly since he and his family had been away, over a week. It was not the kind of weather fit for a holiday, and after a great deal of thought during the day, his family finally agreed with him that it would be better if he went home ahead of the rest of the family and made up the remaining days of his vacation in more seasonable weather. Mme Gabbai helped him pack, and he phoned ahead to his femme de ménage to indicate that he would be coming back on the following day, Friday. The drive back was long and tiring. He left the mountains at 5 in the morning, pacing himself so that he would not have toe hurry in the face of the tourist traffic that plied all summer long on the route through Pont-Saint-Esprit, a main route toward the Spanish border. The road, brushing near the rich historical centres of Arles, Pont-du-Gard, Les Baux, Beaucaire, Tarascon-sur-Nims, Montpellier, Carcassonne, and others, made it a favorite for tourists and created heavy traffic problems. He planned to reach home before dinner. He hoped that it would be waiting for him as he had arranged. As Dr. Gabbai was driving his car on the long route home, back in Pont-Saint-Esprit, Bryant was at last receiving another shipment of flour from Bousquet so that he will be able to return the borrowed sacks he had been using during the time when he was unable to get delivery. For 2 days now he had worked almost exclusively with the grey flour from the north, and he did not relish the idea of continuing that way, at least without some whiter flour to blend with it. He was disappointed when Bousquet informed him that he would have to take along, with a dozen other sacks, at least 6 or 7 of the bags of northern flour. There was nothing else that could be delivered. Bousquet was nervous and edgy because this was the mayor of Saint-Genès-de-Camolles had visited him, and who was now holding off pressures on all sides. He tossed Bryant's empty sacks into his truck with the sacks of other bakers, turned to the Union Meunier. He tried to avoid direct answers to Bryant's penetrating questions about the quality. Bousquet had already written his bitter letter of complaint to his superiors at Nims that morning, and was doing everything that could be done under the distribution system of the Union Municipal. The domain of Joseph Moulin stretched across the rolling foothills of the Massif Central for hundreds of acres. The vines in the rich Rhine soil were cared for with affection and love. Moulin was a perfectionist, and his domain was considered among the finest in the region. It had been in the family since 1789, a testimony to the continuous diligence of the family through the generations. Although they were only a few kilometers from Pont-Saint-Esprit, his vineyard seemed remote from all of civilization, for not another house was visible, except in the far distance. The vines were rich and full that August of 1951, and both Moulin and his wife Lorraine were happy and proud to see that young Joseph, at the age of 25, was taking over more and more of the responsibility for managing the meticulous and infinite chores necessary to bring the grapes to maturity. There is almost a spiritual quality to the raising of fine grapes in France, and young Joseph was beginning to show this quality more each day. What is more, he was liked by all the young men and women of Pont-Saint-Esprit, a favorite among them for his zest for living, his high good humor, his strength and affection. Young Joseph was serious, as the French say about those who are solid and substantial citizens. He was respected by the men who worked for him in the vineyards. In Provence and Languedoc the sun and the Mistral are enemies, and the art of growing grapes requires both strength and cunning to avoid their savage attacks. Young Joseph already had learned how to use both, and he inspired the workers to do likewise. The people in the village liked to talk about the time young Joseph found a worker unwilling to try to lift a sack of nitrate fertilizer onto a truck. He placed the sack in the arms of the worker, it was said, and lifted both to the back of the truck in one smooth motion. At lunchtime on Friday, August 17, young Joseph had come in from the vineyards with a ravenous hunger. He ate unsparingly of Moulin's bouillon gras, a tasty, thin stew for warm weather, which pleased his mother greatly. His 213-pound frame needed nourishment, she felt, and she constantly went out of her way to cook the things he liked. He also ate the bread, nearly a full gross pain, before his hunger gave in. It was the bread Bryant had delivered the day before on his rounds at Carson. The 7 workers at the table also ate heavily, for they enjoyed Mme Moulin's table as much as young Joseph did. There was still some bread left that night after dinner, and as was her custom, Mme Moulin fed the scraps to the cat, the ducks, and the dog. Strangely enough, the dog leaped to the platter on the kitchen floor, rushed through the remains of the bouillon gras without hesitation, but only sniffed at and backed away from the bread. Since he had never rejected bread before, Mme Moulin tasted again the small chunk remaining in her hand, but found nothing wrong with it, except perhaps that it seemed flatter than usual. She thought the Moulin family retired early that Friday night, after the same dinner-time menu that had been followed at lunch. The heat of the midi sun stayed on through the night, which was without a stirring of air. At the time when you need the Mistral, men at Provengles have said, it will never blow. In his room young Joseph Moulin awoke at some indistinguishable hour of the night with sharp, colicky pains in his stomach. They made him uncomfortable, but he had had worse pains, and he finally fell back asleep, in exhaustion from his work in the fields and vineyards. In the morning he lay better. There were no complaints from the others, although Mme Moulin told them how strange it was the dog had rejected the bread in the bouillon gras. Father and son chided her, ate their petit déjeuner, and went out to join the work crew already waiting for them. Cleaning up the kitchen, Mme Moulin was stopped short by an utterly strange and sharp cry from the cat. She looked down on the floor, as the cat screamed in agony again. Then it rolled over, writhed, twisted, shook, and ran screaming toward the wall, trying to climb it. Its hair was literally standing up on end. She ran to it, tried to pick it up, to comfort it, but it hissed and spit at her, then screamed in the most unearthly sound she had ever heard. Alone in the house, she had no one to turn to, and all her efforts to pick up the cat were hopeless. Again and again it battered itself against the wall, then rolled on the floor in convulsions. It was a hideous, frightening sight, she later said, shocking beyond belief. Unable to climb the wall now, it ran into it at blinding speed, as if it were intent on self-destruction. In tears, Mme Moulin coaxed and pleaded with the cat to come to her, but each time was repulsed. Then with another terrifying scream, clawing wildly at the air, it dropped to the tiles, motionless. In a moment it pulled itself up on its forelegs, then dragged its hind legs across the floor, collapsing again next to the stove. At this moment Mme Moulin looked out the open kitchen door to the barnyard. One duck was lying prostrate on its side. Another was staggering, as if drunk, beside it. 3 others were clacking ceaselessly, their bills stretched as if they were going to break. They were marching and strutting like penguins, flapping their wings and waddling in a most unnatural way. From the doorway Mme Moulin watched them in awe. She had been brought up on armors, lived all her life among domestic animals. She had never seen anything like this, ever. The 3 lively ducks were now reaching a crescendo in their quacking and their strutting. Their waddling became more exaggerated, their likeness to penguins even more pronounced. She crossed over the gravel yard to the prostrate duck and lifted his head. It fell back limply. The second was Python turning slowly in circles, then it dropped also. The others continued their wild chorus. She looked anxiously out over the vineyards, but her husband and son and the workers were now here in sight. Terrified, she ran back into the kitchen. The cat had not moved from where it had fallen. Carefully, slowly, she picked it up. It was dead not far away, in the same village of Carson. Felix Meissen was feeding the leftover bread to his dog, a chore he enjoyed along with his work as a cultivator in the region. A quiet and well-liked farmer, he had built up over the years a prosperous and well-tended farm, raised a happy and contented family. After the dog had wolfed down the chunks, Meissen played with him affectionately, throwing a stick out to be retrieved, roughing up his fur and accepting a few friendly licks on the ear. 3 hours later the dog limply rose from the kitchen floor, whimpering strangely. It moved out to the farmyard, Meissen following in astonishment. He had never seen it act this way before. About 20 feet away from the door, the dog stopped in its tracks, leaped grotesquely in the air, and began running swiftly in a wide circle. Misen tried futilely to stop him, but each time he got near the dog, it snarled and snapped at him viciously. At moments the dog would seize a rock, crunch it fiercely in its teeth until at last 2 teeth fell out, and blood dripped from its mouth. For nearly 10 minutes the macabre scene continued. Misanao joined her husband to try to calm the animal. Running more slowly now, dragging its motionless back legs, it finally wobbled to a hollow in the dirt and sunk down in it. Its breathing was labored and heavy, and the dry blood was caked in its mouth. Within the hour, it, too, was dead. Chapter 2. The dog had been a favorite of the family. Its death affected the Misen severely. So much so that Misen almost failed to notice the gripping pains in his own stomach, which had begun shortly after the dog had died. Perhaps, thought Misen, this was a reaction to the loss of his pet. He lay down on his bed, in sorrow, pain, and puzzlement. Friday evening at La Villette was a festive one for the Testevin family and their pensioners. Friends from Toulon, laden with gifts and food, arrived in happy spirits, glad to visit the country away from the noise and clatter of the city. They brought their own bread, a common custom in France, and presented Testevin with a mess of truite de rivière, brown trout freshly caught from the Rhône, and a bottle of pastis. and Lemaki were jewelers, long-time friends of the Testevins, and they brightened the dinner table that evening with tales of life in the coastal city of Toulon, as Delacroix spoke of his travels in South America. The trout, smothered in almonds and olive oil, was cooked to a crisp brown turn by Testevin. They lingered over the dinner a long time, sipping the wine and pastis. The Lemakis ate their own bread from Toulon, while the rest off table finished up the bread of Bryant, supplemented that afternoon with more loaves from his shop on the Grande Rue. After a short session of cards, Delacroix excused himself and climbed the narrow stone stairs of the old house to his quarters. He read the paper for a brief time, then prepared for bed. He fell asleep quickly, but shortly after 2 in the morning he awoke feeling extremely nauseous. He now regretted having eaten the trout at dinner, delicious as it had been. In addition, he found himself inexplicably chilly, although the night was warm and had cooled off little from the August day. He got up, went to his closet to fetch another blanket, but found himself shivering under it. He was unable to sleep, and also unable to vomit, in spite of the strong feeling of nausea. It was not long after he had crawled, shivering, under the blanket that he heard others in the house stirring. It was clear from the sounds in the Testevin room that Testevin was sick, and he tried to get up again to see if he could help. Weakness prevented him from rising, but he was convinced now that the trout had caused trouble not only with him, but with the rest of the household. He lay there awake and shivering through the night until the sun came up. About 2 hours before the Testevin household sat down to their festive dinner on Friday evening, Dr. Albert Gabbai arrived at his home. He pulled his car into his courtyard, stretched as he got out of the car, and went into his house. It had been a long, tiring trip. He was greeted by the femme de ménage, who told him that his waiting room was filled with people, some of them forayed by Dr. View, who had learned that Dr. Gabbai was returning from vacation, and whose office was unusually overcrowded that day. In the waiting room were nearly a dozen patients. Dr. Gabbai was astonished, but regained his composure and called in the first patient. He was the head of a family of 13 people, with 7 members sick from severe stomach trouble. When Dr. Gabbai learned that the 6 other members of the family were in the waiting room, he had them file into his office one by one for unnecessarily quick examination. Their complaints were identical: stomach upset, nausea, chills. They had no fever. In fact, most of children and the father were experiencing hypothermia, their temperatures being measurably below normal. None of them was seriously ill, but the fact that so many in one family were sick indicated the possibility of a mild poisoning, and would have to be investigated thoroughly. What had they eaten the night before? Most important, had they all eaten the same thing? When the doctor was assured that the entire family had shared the exact same food, his puzzlement mounted. How could 7 members suffer from food poisoning, while the other 6 experienced no trouble whatever? He questioned the father in minute detail for nearly 15 minutes. Nothing was revealed that could explain why nearly half the family remained perfectly healthy in the face of apparent food poisoning in the other half. The meat was served from a casserole. Were there 2 casseroles at the table? No. Was any fish course served? No. Were any chemicals kept in the household? No. The questioning seemed to be futile. How about the seating arrangement? Was there any relation to this and the way the food was served? The father hesitated a moment here. He recalled now that half the family sat on one side of the table and the other half on the other. Yes, there was a definite seating arrangement. Thinking carefully now, he reconstructed this in his mind. Not only was there a definite seating arrangement, but yes, all the children with him in Dr. Gabai's office were seated on one side of the table. There was no question about it. But what had they eaten that those on the other side of the table had not? Ostensibly, nothing. Going back to the original question, those at the table had shared exactly the same food, and there seemed to be no logical explanation for the clear division between the sick and the well in the family. The lack of logic for the situation plagued Dr. Gabai. He prescribed a mild ameliorative for the stomach upsets and arranged to stop by the family's house the first available moment. In the meantime, he requested the father to keep whatever leftovers remained from the food of the night before. The family filed out of office, and Dr. Gabai called in the next patient. He was M. Guigu, a garage owner in the village, another patient referred by Dr. View because of the latter's overcrowded office. M. Guigu presented the same symptoms as the first patients. He was older, weaker, and less resilient. He had, he explained, eaten his meal, as was his habit, at the pension where he lived in the village, the Hettel Redortia. Were any others at the hotel stricken with stomach upset? M. Guigu did not think so. What was served? Nothing particularly suspect. Did he eat anything that the others did not? The answer was negative. Again, Dr. Gabai was faced with an enigma. He prescribed a similar mild remedy, but ordered M. Guigu to bed immediately because of his age, then made a note to stop by the Hotel Redortia to see what might be unearthed regarding the food served there the night before, the dinner to which Dr. Gabai had been looking forward all through the long drive back from the Pyrenees was ready, but it grew cold as more patients filed into the office, all with similar complaints. Some felt giddy, as if they had drunk too much wine, but they had drunk no more than usual. Some vomited. Some had diarrhea. Many had chills, reflected by subnormal temperatures, but none seemed seriously ill. When he collapsed into bed at 11 that night, Dr. Gabai was confident that the worst was over, and that the town would return to normal in the morning. When morning came, Dr. Gabai's fears lessened. Reports from the patients of the day before indicated that they felt much better, for the most part. A telephone consultation with Dr. View indicated the same conditions. The patients he had seen on Friday were showing marked signs of improvement, although his phone was already being clogged with new patients, suffering from the same symptoms. There was comfort in realizing that the attacks were apparently mild and benign, but it was important to try to track down the cause as soon as possible to prevent such an annoyance and nuisance from breaking out again. Dr. View confessed to feeling shaky and ill himself, yet he felt he could not pinpoint the cause to anything particular that he had eaten the day before. Further, Dr. Chanak, the third doctor in town, was definitely ill, which created a temporary extra load on Dr. View and Dr. Gabai. However, there was every indication that the new flurry of patients would subside, just as the first had. Meanwhile, the two doctors agreed there was nothing much to do but grin and bear it. They agreed to check back with each other later in the day, as soon as they had the chance to try to investigate the cause of the nuisance. Dr. Gabai's first house call that Saturday morning was the result of an urgent request from Francine, sister of Mme Charpale, who reported that the latter was seriously ill with symptoms that she had never before witnessed. During the night, Mme Charpale had a major fit of convulsions, her eyes reversed in her head, her mouth foamed, saliva drained from her mouth, her features became unrecognizable. She was mute and silent now, and she had been moved downstairs to the rooms of her mother on Thitu de Quatre Coins, so care could be taken of her 9-month-old baby. Dr. Gabbai lost no time in reaching the house, where he found Mme Charpale in another fit of convulsions. They subsided quickly after he arrived. The symptoms here were clear and unmistakable. They showed every sign of being those of one cries d'epilepsy. Yet what was most puzzling was the fact that there was no history whatever of epilepsy in the patient, and it would be extremely rare for a patient to have reached her 20th birthday, which was the age of Mme Charpale, without having manifested any symptoms before. For the second time in as many days he was faced with a major mystery. Another possibility was tetanus, but Heckled find no infection anywhere. Although he could see absolutely no relationship between the case of Mme Charpale and his patients of the day before, he inquired at length about what food had been eaten in the household. There was nothing particularly suspect, although Mme Charpale's mother pointed out that she had eaten a piece of melon the day before, which had been the only food Mme Charpale had eaten that the rest of the family had not. The remains of the melon, however, had already been thrown out, and there were no means of checking into this as a possibility for the cause of the attack. Further, the symptoms did not seem to relate to food poisoning. The doctor indicated that he would keep Mme Charpale under observation, and return later in the day. At the household of the large family who had first visited his office, the doctor was relieved to find that those who had been sick were in better health. He again studied the situation of the suspected meal 2 evenings before. He verified that the 7 members of the family who had become ill had sat on one side of the table, and the 6 who were untouched by any sickness had sat opposite them. But still no one could recall any special way the food was served so that nearly half would be stricken and the other half remain unscathed. Then one of the children remembered an important thing: she had been sent to the bakery to get 1 loaf of bread, which had not been enough. When she went out to get a second loaf, she went to a different bakery, the shop of M. Bryand. Now she recalled clearly that those who fell ill had all sat on the side of the table where M. Bryand's bread had been served. Slowly, several other members of the family were able to recall that this must have been true. They were not certain, however. The puzzle still remained, but a definite clue had been obtained. Dr. Gabbai took samples of some of the portions of the food that remained and brought them back to his office. Analysis of the food would have to wait until it could reach a laboratory. He was greeted on his return with the same overcrowded waiting room. His femme de ménage told him that his phone had been ringing constantly with many calls from both the village and the surrounding country areas. Among them was a call from Mme Misen in Karsan, who said that her husband was in severe pain and asked if the doctor could possibly come as soon as possible. After treating those in his waiting room, all of whom were mildly ill with the same persistent complaints, Dr. Gabbai got into his car and drove as quickly as possible to the farmhouse of M. Misen. He was greeted at the door by Mme Misen, who was embarrassed to say that her husband was now much better and that it must have been just a simple attack of indigestion. She apologized profusely for asking him to come all this distance for a false alarm. Dr. Gabbai, known to all the people in the region as a warm and generous person, reassured her and went to the bedside of her husband. He was sitting up in bed now and no longer in pain. His symptoms were the usual ones, which Dr. Gabbai had by now come to expect of every patient he was treating. M. Misen protested that his wife should not have called him, that he had tried to persuade her not to do so. After the examination, Dr. Gabbai was able to show him that on the basis of the other patients with the same symptoms, he should be feeling much better soon. But the doctor wanted to know just what he had eaten in the last 2 days, especially, where had he bought the bread. M. Misen then related the story of how M. Bryand usually delivered the bread to his farm and of how the delivery had not arrived on Thursday afternoon. He went on to explain his call at M. Bryand's shop, how he had softly chided M. Bryand for forgetting the delivery, and how he had bought and carried the bread back to his house himself. Now a second piece of evidence suggesting that it might have been the bread had come to the attention of Dr. Gabbai. After prescribing some medicine for Amazon, he left at once to finish up his investigation. He felt at last he was getting somewhere, even though full proof was yet to come. Just after he left, the Missons remembered a disquieting thing they had forgotten to tell him of. The sad and tragic death of their dog, who, they recalled now with sharp and sudden horror, had died shortly after eating the same bread. When he got back to town, Dr. Gabbai tried to reach Dr. View but without success. He then stopped by the town hall to notify the authorities that a mild outbreak of food poisoning seemed evident. He was asked to report more facts, and an investigation was immediately promised by the mayor of the village. From the town hall he went to the Hotel Redortia to visit M. Guigu, who was feeling in better spirits and seemed to be shaking off the annoying symptoms of the previous day. But here another clear piece of evidence was contributed. Pressed about where the bread he ate came from, M. Guigu related that he always brought his own bread to the hotel, bread he always bought at the shop of M. Bryant. He was the only one of the 10 boarders who ate the bread and the only one who was ill. The doctor returned to his office, notified the mayor's office that the bread of M. Bryant was definitely suspect, and once again tried in vain to reach Dr. View, who was himself so busy making his rounds that he could not get back to his office. It was not until 11 o'clock on Saturday evening that Dr. View and Dr. Gabbai were able to meet in the latter's office to compare notes. The facts added up to rather alarming proportions, somewhat mollified, however, by the mildness of the illness, which by now both doctors were certain could be attributed to the bread of M. Bryant. Between them the two doctors counted some 230 patients in Pont Saint-Esprit, and in the surrounding villages and countryside nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea were among the most constant symptoms. Hypothermia, subnormal temperature, was almost universal. This was accompanied by severe shivering, in spite of the hot August temperatures. As many cases of slow pulse, bradycardy, were noted. Enlargement of the pupils, mydriase, was also evident in many cases. A large proportion exhibited angoisse, severe difficulty in breathing. Because of the impossibly overloaded schedule of both doctors, neither was able to make a complete and intelligent analysis of the overall picture. Independently, they had arrived at the conclusion that M. Bryant's bread was the source of the trouble. Neither had had a single patient who had not eaten the bread out of the Chopin Grande Rue. In fact, nearly all residents on Grande Rue, habitual buyers of M. Bryant's bread, were sick with the key symptoms to a greater or lesser degree. The only encouraging thing about the situation was the fact that the symptoms were still mild, and seemed to be clearing up after the initial attacks were over. Even though it was late at night, both doctors went to see Mayor Hebrard at his home. The first action seemed clear and obvious: every bakery in town should be closed pending a further and immediate investigation by the police. The doctors would continue to accept any patient they encountered regardless of whose patient he normally was. The news that Dr. Chanak was recovering from his illness was an encouraging and hopeful sign, because both Dr. View and Dr. Gabbai were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. All three looked forward to Sunday morning, since there was reason to believe the worst was over. Both Dr. View and Dr. Chanak, who had eaten the bread themselves, were already beginning to feel better after their initial discomfort. On Saturday morning, before the doctors had begun their strange and exhausting day, M. Delacroix rose at his usual hour at La Villette, feeling slightly better than he had during the night. He was not, oddly enough, at all tired, even though he had no sleep at all after his attack had struck him. Downstairs in the big country kitchen, Mme. Testovin was already at work. Both agreed that the trout must have been the cause of their uncomfortable night, for it seemed that everyone in the household, except the visitors from Toulon, had been sick. Neither M. Testovin nor Emile had slept yet. Both had already gone out to work in the vineyards. M. Delacroix and Mme. Testovin agreed that everyone would probably feel better after the effects had worn off, later on in the day. The guests, who seemed to have escaped illness, were still asleep. M. Delacroix cycled down the hill to the village in another burning midday and arrived at the Coopérative des Céréales de Pont Saint-Esprit promptly at 8 o'clock. Aside from his feeling light-headed, the disturbances of the previous night did not seem tolling with him. Saturday at the office was always a busy day because it was necessary to make out all the checks for the farmers' wheat and grain payments and wind up the affairs of the week. Mademoiselle Woolschlager was already there when he arrived, and they sat down to tackle the endless details of the routine. All the records of the shipments and receipts for each client had to be adjusted according to the weights registered on the scales during the previous week, and the checks that were prepared for each client required innumerable small calculations. It was painstaking work. During the process, M. Delacroix began to find a strange dizziness coming over him, which he tried desperately to shake. He said nothing about it to Mademoiselle Woolschlager, but she began to notice the fact that M. Delacroix was not feeling at all well, and she asked him about it. Sure, he told her, that it must be the trout we ate last night. Nearly everyone in the house felt the same way last night. Perhaps, said Mademoiselle Woolschlager, I could take some of the work off your hands. TT will take all day for the two of us to finish the job, he said. I couldn't let you do that. The checks were the most important item on the agenda that morning, and they concentrated on those. But by 11:15, the checks were less than half prepared. The president of the cooperative arrived at that moment, and expecting the task to be completed was astonished to find that the job was taking so long. There was a heated discussion. M. Delacroix, rising to cross the file, found that he could not get up from the chair and fell back in it. The room began to spin, and he found it necessary to squeeze the arms of the chair to keep his equilibrium. He told the president, who was nervous and impatient, that he would return early from lunch and that the checks would be completed by mid-afternoon, only a few hours behind schedule. Reassured, the president left the office. M. Delacroix found the dizzy spell subsiding and decided that perhaps he would feel stronger after lunch. He was able to get up now, and he crossed the office to the door without difficulty. Mademoiselle Woolschlager tried to assist him, but he refused her help. "T'll be perfectly all right," he said, "as soon as I get something in my stomach." Mile. Woolschlager, worried, watched him from the door. She knew that he was a stubborn and determined man when he wanted to be, and that it was useless to offer him further help. She watched as he mounted his bicycle, and even though he had some difficulty mounting it, he began pedaling down the road, with the bicycle wobbling beneath him. God help him make it, she sighed to herself. She knew instinctively that he would not be returning that afternoon. The ride up the hill to La Villette seemed a million miles to M. Delacroix. The road seemed to shrink and expand in front of houses. The villas along the side of the road took on brilliant and indescribable colors. When he looked down at his hands on the handlebars, they seemed to stretch miles in front of him. The road would widen out to infinity and then return to a size no larger than a ribbon. The front wheel of his bicycle would begin to grow until it seemed to encompass the entire world, and suddenly it would return to normal. He had a strange feeling of being outside himself, as if he were looking down at the figure pumping so laboriously up the hill. The journey seemed to be taking him centuries, yet at the same time he seemed to be moving at an incredible speed, whisking on the wings of a magic carpet past the vineyards, which were no longer ordinary vineyards, but blazing rows of glorious colors. He seemed to float in time and space, and as he entered the courtyard of La Villette, he felt he was borne in the wings of a mythical golden chariot. Mme. Testovin, at the washing well of the courtyard, saw him come. It was a pitiful, painful sight. His bicycle was wobbling dizzily over the rough gravel. His face was strained, pale, and pinched. She ran toward him, because she knew he was going to fall, but she was too late. Near the old well his bicycle spun crazily out from under him to the left, while he spun off to the right onto the dirt. Breathing heavily, he lay limply on the ground. She helped him to his feet, and he seemed to recover his equilibrium quickly. Painfully, with her help, he made his way to his room. By the time they reached it, he was already feeling much better. He refused to let her send someone for the doctor, because he was certain now that the worst was over. He begged her not to be concerned, explaining that this must be a new form of his older illness, which had made him leave Paris and come to the country. If by the next morning, Sunday, he did not feel better, he agreed he would let her call the doctor. Fully clothed, he collapsed on the bed in exhaustion. Chapter 3. On Saturday, before the doctors had begun to suspect that bread was the source of the ailments that were coming to their attention, Bryant worked in his shop as usual. He had no inkling that his bread had anything whatever to do with the fact that he had not been able to sleep for 24 hours, and that his wife, his helper, and he himself were feeling mildly upset with stomach trouble, as so many others in the village were feeling. Events grow slowly. Those facts that emerge clearly and unmistakably in hindsight are often muddled and obscure in the early beginnings. It isn't after the small links of the chain are assembled that any kind of a picture begins to emerge. Further, the beginnings of a tragedy are often infinitely small, undiscernible in the everyday pressures of ordinary life. On that Saturday, people were almost totally unaware that many others were feeling liverish, and since the symptoms were so mild, little talk took place in the village streets that day. Tom Bryant, the mild upset experienced by him and his family could have been the result of any number of things, and because of its lightness, it was barely worth thinking about. Hardly anyone in the village was comparing notes, and those who did, shrugged off their complaints, as most people do with the minor annoyance of living. Bryant, for instance, was preoccupied with a trip to Theodec River, where 2 of his children were on vacation. He and his wife left almost at dawn early Sunday morning. They were pleased to be away from the routine of the week and were looking forward to greeting their children along the pleasant wooded banks of the river, where the heat of the bakery and the village streets could be forgotten. His wife was feeling slightly better, and the only unusual thing he noticed was that he had not been able to sleep again for a second night, yet he felt completely refreshed and vigorous, ready to enjoy their brief respite. Just a few hours before Bryant left for the Ardèche, in thickly dark hours on Sunday morning, the phone of Dr. Gabet rang again. Mme. Maisen's voice was trembling now. She was obviously fighting to keep down panic. "It's my husband again," she said. "He is terribly ill now. Terribly. He can hardly breathe, hardly talk. Please, doctor. I know you must be exhausted. But is there anything that can be done?" "Anything? I forgot to tell you, our dog died after eating the bread. Does that have anything to do with this?" Within minutes Dr. Gabet was dressed and getting into his car. The streets of the village were black and silent. He streaked along the Boulevard Gambetta, past the Hotel de Ville, which housed both the town hall and the police station, screeched left on the Rue Vauban, and shot out the narrow, twisting road to Carsan. The death of the dog was a new and disturbing element. If its death could be traced directly to eating the bread, the whole texture of the emerging picture would be changed. It would no longer be a question of mild food poisoning with a brief illness, a quick recovery, and a happy prognosis. Up until this moment there had not been too much to be disturbed about, except the enormous number of patients. There were hundreds of cases of this sort in medical history, at church picnics, sporting events, holiday camps where a temporary but vague ailment causes widespread but not serious damage. The theory that Bryant's bread was the cause of all this was still not proven, and it was necessary not to jump to conclusions in spite of persuasive evidence. And if it were this bread, what would be the poison in it? No information had been circulated at this time about the illnesses in Connaught, or Bagnères-sur-Cèze, or the other towns, even among the doctors. In the cases involving the bread of Jaussant, no doctor in the village had been summoned, and both Dr. Gabet and Dr. Vieux were ignorant at this time about the flurry that took place several days before. Most important, if Maisen's case turned out to be as serious as his wife indicated over the phone, it was urgent to find out the exact source of the poison. The flour? The salt? The water? The yeast? The symptoms, though not too many had presented themselves to the overworked doctors at this time, did not seem to fit into any classical pattern. There was not enough of a distinctive clinical syndrome to permit exact and specific treatment. If Maisen's case, in turning serious, foreshadowed other similar cases. The exact identification of the poison would become urgent. Food poisoning took many forms. Chemical contaminants, such as heavy metals, fluorides, and others, were common. Toxins increased by bacterial growth and a wide spectrum of organic substances that occur in natural foods were other factors to be considered. The choices faced by Dr. Gabbai, if the outbreak suddenly turned serious, were confusing and numerous, especially without any clear-cut clinical symptoms to point the way to the discovery of the poison. Even typhoid, shigellosis, streptococcal pharyngitis, diphtheria, brucellosis, infectious hepatitis, and other diseases were often foodborne, although not necessarily classed as food poisoning. It was even necessary to consider epidemic nausea and vomiting arising from viruses. As he drove into the farmyard of the Meissen domain, Dr. Gabbai realized the limitations he faced in the diagnosis of this strange problem, which was now becoming overwhelming. Meissen met him at the door. She was haggard and distraught. "It began shortly after your visit earlier," she said. Hugh was quiet for some time, then suddenly, without any warning, he jumped up out of bed and tried to run away from the house. He ran out into the yard like a wild man. Then he burst back in, dropped down on the bed again, and rolled back and forth. Hugh was twisting and writhing. It was terrible. Then he shrieked in complete terror and huddled under his blankets, throwing them off, pulling them back up again, claiming he was either freezing or burning up. Right now he is mute. He is barely breathing. "Please help us, doctor. Please." Dr. Gabbai went immediately to the bedside. Quickly he made his examination. The pupils were widely dilated. Temperature, subnormal. Pulse, slow and barely discernible. Respiration labored and difficult. Sweating profusely. Blood pressure, far below normal. Extremities, cold. It was obvious that Meissen was a desperately ill man on the verge of a cardiovascular collapse. Dr. Gabbai went immediately to the phone and called the hospital at Nims, nearly an hour away. "There is nothing we can do here," he explained to Meissen. "At the hospital they'll do all they can for your husband, everything." It took over an hour for the ambulance to arrive. During that time Dr. Gabbai fought to stay awake, tend his patient, and comfort the distraught Meissen. He also had time to think about the phantom he was trying to fight. The diagnosis was extremely difficult. Nearly every food poisoning brought on the same initial symptoms: abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomiting. But here was a case, and the others too in lesser form, with a whole new complex of clinical symptoms which failed to fit any set pattern. In Salmonella gastroenteritis, for instance, there was nearly always a fever, but here the temperature was nearly always subnormal. In addition, the extreme dilation of the pupils and the strange psychical outbreak revealed in Meissen's case did not seem to fit into any conventional food poisoning pattern. Botulism was another possibility, but in none of the cases were the conventional symptoms for this condition prevalent: tony degree, sudden hoarseness, constipation, cranial nerve paralysis. Staphylococcal food poisoning did cause lowered temperature and blood pressure, but support of this diagnosis would have toed for further tests. It was a question now of fighting a phantom whose name and identity were not known. Until they were known, only the most superficial treatment could be given, treatment for symptoms rather than causes. Until this case there had been no real emergency situation, since most of the patients appeared to be on the mend after a light touch of abdominal trouble. There had been a few odd symptoms, it was true, but they, too, had seemed to be on the verge of disappearing. It was also possible that Meissen was not suffering from the suspected bread but from another disease, which would require laboratory tests and careful hospital analysis. The most fearsome possibility stayed in the back of Dr. Gabbai's mind as a result of what Meissen told him about over the phone: the death of the dog shortly after eating the suspected bread. As casually as possible, to try to avoid disturbing her, he confirmed the incident with Meissen as they waited. It was vital to correlate the information, and every small clue would help. The dog had eaten exclusively the bread bought from M. Brian that afternoon. It had not yet had its regular food. It had broken out in a most grotesque and horrifying fit, most unnatural and terrifying. The headlights of the ambulance shined through the kitchen door, and it skidded to a stop just outside. Gently and with care M. Misen was carried out, just as the first streaks of dawn were appearing in the sky over Morne Venters in the distance. Mme Misen entered the ambulance beside her husband and nodded her head in silent prayer. Dr. Gabby watched them leave and suddenly became aware of the overwhelming exhaustion that enveloped him. But time was pressing hard now, and he climbed into the car to drive back to the village. Winding down the hill from Carson, he drove directly into the rising sun, which accented the burning in his eyes. He had had no sleep during the night, and only a little the night before. Perhaps he was overconcerned about the spread of the sickness. Perhaps the worst was over. But it was no time to take chances. He drove directly to the home of Mayor Hebron and pounded on the door until the mayor opened it, sleepily, to let him in. "We're facing a severe crisis," he told the mayor. M. Misen is seriously ill, and I have strong doubts about his survival. All the evidence points to the suspected bread. His dog died from eating it. We must call together both Dr. View and Dr. Chanak, if he's well enough now to help us. This may be more serious than Wehave thought. Within half an hour the two other doctors had arrived. Dr. Gabby gave them the details of M. Misen's case and then learned that neither of the other two doctors had themselves been to bed the night before. Their phones had been continually ringing all night long. It was impossible to tell how many people without phones of their own would have been calling if it had been possible. The symptoms of the patients were exactly the same as those Dr. Gabby had observed. And after the temporary improvement of the previous day, several patients now appeared more seriously ill. The total number of cases among the doctors had now risen to over 280. Mme Charpale's pseudo-epileptic fit now seemed to fit into the pattern, because the other two doctors reported similar reactions among their patients. Most disturbing was a confirming report from Dr. View about the effect of the unknown poison on animals. Dr. View had arrived at the home of Joseph Moulin to find the entire family and the work crew suffering from the same symptoms that had now become classiques at Pont Saint-Esprit. Young Joseph Moulin was suffering the most: aching joints, alternate shivering and burning, low blood pressure, slow pulse, all the rest. His father was also in bad condition, and although Mme Moulin suffered less than the others, she was by no means lightly ill. But Dr. View had learned, every animal on the Moulin farm that had eaten the bread was now dead, a fact that, joined with the evidence of the death of the Misen dog, almost unmistakably pinpointed the source of the trouble as the Brian bread and also foreshadowed far more serious consequences than the preliminary findings had indicated. The tracing of the source of the poison was, of course, urgent, and both Dr. View and Dr. Gabby had instructed their patients to hold on to not only the remains of the bread that had been eaten but also the bodies of the animals who had been stricken so suddenly and violently. Le médecin chef of the Department du Gard along with the prefect of Nîmes and the gendarmerie would be arriving within hours from Nîmes. In the meantime the doctors would be treating the symptoms as best they could, until the samples of the food and the corpses of the animals could be rushed to police scientific laboratories in Marseilles. Dr. Gabby would keep in constant touch with the medical authorities at the hospital in Nîmes regarding the case of Felix Misen. His instinct and experience told him that it would be fortunate if M. Misen lasted 24 hours. A meeting at the town hall, La Mairie, was scheduled for 8 that evening, after the doctors had had a chance to cover as many patients as possible during the day. As far as sleep was concerned, for the doctors that would be out of question. Dr. View, his own wife and family in bed and ill from the poisoning, had barely had time during the night to follow their progress. So great was the tide of calls pouring into the telephones of all three doctors that there were stretches of hours when they had to remain unanswered. Dr. Chanak, still ill himself, painfully planned to continue his rounds as usual. On Sunday morning, August 19th, shortly after the doctors had had their meeting with Mayor Hebrod, Mademoiselle Wulschlager rose to dress for early Mass at the Église Saint-Saturnin. She was sharply disturbed by the report, sent to her by messenger at the office, that her employer, M. Delacroix, was unable to return to the office because of illness. He had looked so weak, so pained, when he left the office just before noon on Saturday, that her heart had gone out to him. She now determined, light a candle for him that morning at the church. Like many of the other citizens off village, she was still unaware of the extent of the outbreak, whatever it was. The doctors and the mayor had carefully avoided passing the word around in order not to spread any kind of panic among the populace. The problem of treating an unknown enemy was massive enough. Without having to deal with hysteria, when she arrived outside the church, she saw the clusters of people that had gathered to talk, and they talked only of the strange disease sweeping the town. Mon Dieu, one parishioner said to her as she arrived for the 8:30 Mass. "Do you realize what has happened? Everybody in the village is sick. They say it comes from the bread of M. Bryant." "No," said another, "it comes from the water. Something has gone wrong with the water supply." "It's the heat," said a third. "Le soleil brûle tous les temps, c'est terrible." "The animals," a farmer from nearby added. "All the animals are dying. None of them in the region will live another day." Mademoiselle Wulschlager was shocked, but she did not immediately associate the sickness of M. Delacroix with the rumors now sweeping the town. His problem, according to the messenger, was fish, not bread. And she was sure he would be well and able to work by Monday. She went into the ancient cathedral, through the weathered massive door that had greeted the parishioners since 1475, went to a pew in the rear of the church, and kneeled in prayer. Beside her seat, on a stone pillar, was inscribed the Lord's Prayer, as translated into the Provençal dialect by Frederick Mistral startled Smiley. "Nost per exi sutun naum se santifique, town regen now saveng, adavow. Ta volanta se fecum adamant." She read the words as music came forth from the organ, and they gave her comfort. She loved the saints, whose figures appeared in niches along the sides of the church, but she liked to pray directly to God, and she did. The church itself had remained there in the village for centuries and was a symbol of strength in the face of historical adversity. It had been rebuilt and reborn many times, through the ravages of time and the inhumanities of man. The people of Pont Saint-Esprit were equally strong and tenacious, characteristics they would need if tragedy struck the town once again. She noticed also that there were many gaps in the congregation that morning, many more than usual. She looked up to the statue of Saint Saturnin, serene in his niche near the altar, and drew further comfort from his countenance. Also in the church that morning was Francine, who lighted a candle for her sister and prayed that the arm of the Virgin statue would not symbolize another major tragedy for the town. Although she had forced the incident out of her mind, it returned in full force as she began to hear the story circulating in the streets that Sunday morning. Worse was the condition of her sister, Mme Charpale, who seemed to be sinking into a dark and distressing state with most mysterious symptoms. She would rise in the morning, go to the kitchen table in her mother's house, and sit vacantly staring down at the table for hours. Although her physical symptoms seemed to lessen, she would stay seated at the table, neither looking at, nor responding to, any of her family. When her 9-month-old baby was held in front of her, she would turn away from it or stare at it vacantly without recognition. If a glass of water or a piece of food was put in her hands, she would let it fall on the table or the floor. The prescribed medicines were useless, though at times her mother was able to force her to drink a cup of milk or sip an infusion of thyme, an ancient French remedy, popular in the Midi, which was made by pouring boiling water over leaves of thyme. Francine prayed devoutly for her sister, as she did for the others in the village who were suffering and apparently facing a growing tragedy whose boundaries were nowhere in sight. The only good news passed around after the Mass that Sunday morning was that many people were apparently beginning to feel much stronger and better. In fact, one strange thing was that they were not only recovering but seemed to be experiencing an irresistible elation, their sense of well-being suddenly soaring to new and unprecedented heights, as if all their cares had been lifted and their problems dissolved. A sense of exaggerated fraternity had become apparent in some of the least likely people who only a day before had been ill. One man, known for his rancer and disagreeable attitude, had embraced a former enemy on the streets and had suggested that old enmities be buried forever. Another general observation seemed to emerge from the congregation after the services that day. Some of the people had noticed that since their brief illness they were infused with a force and energy they had never experienced before. Said a middle-aged lady to Mademoiselle Woolschlager as they were leaving the church, "I think this illness, whatever it is, has done me a lot of good. I've never had so much energy in me life. I know I haven't been able to sleep at all since Thursday evening, but I haven't been tired in the least. Last night I got up after trying to get to sleep for nearly an hour. I took out some sewing, thinking it would make me sleepy. I worked, and must have finished up more sewing than I could do in 3 days' time. I thought I would be so tired this morning that I would sleep all through the Mass. But nothing like that happened. Right now I'm as wide awake as I've ever been, and I've never felt better." As the woman talked, Mademoiselle Woolschlager could not help but notice that the woman's eyes had an abnormal luster and brilliance, that she was talking much faster than was her habit, and that she seemed to be inclined to go on talking forever. It was not the conversation of a person in robust health, it was more the strained, forced frenzy of a person bordering on hysteria. After mumbling a polite au revoir, she left the still-talking woman, walked along the Rue de la Paroisse in front of the church, then moved toward the stairs between the Église Saint-Saturnin and the 12th-century Église Saint-Pierre. It was an empty but magnificent structure, which was never rebuilt after it had been pillaged during the French Revolution. From the terrace she could see the Radine swirling southward, and the endless arches of the bridge that gave the village its name. From where she stood, the ghosts of history seemed to surround her on all sides. Not only had the Romans, the soldiers of the wars of religion, and the popes and antipopes been there, but the knights of 3 major crusades had also marched through and stayed in the town on their way to the Holy Land. Even the presence of the English during the 100 Years' War could be felt, but this was the year of 1951, not the Dark Middle Ages, and here was the possibility of a plague, and that was the accurate word, if what the villagers were saying was true, a plague as terrifying as those that had swept the village in medieval times, and what of modern science and medicine? From all reports bruited about after Mass that morning, they had no effect whatever on those who were treated. And what about the diagnosis of the malady? None of the doctors had been able to give a clue. Yet people were suffering, no one knew exactly how many at this time, or becoming strangely hysterical in some form of euphoria that was totally meaningless and unsupported by objective reasons. She left the plaza between the 2 churches and made her way back through the Rue des Anciens prisons, toward the Place de la République. Everywhere, groups of people, talking and gesticulating excitedly, were gathered in the narrow streets. Some refused to believe it was serious. Others predicted the end of the village, the country, the world. Those among the townspeople who took the affair lightly were the most justified on that Sunday, because the actual confirmation of any serious reactions had not reached the populace yet, nor had the death of any animals been noted except by rumor. Only the doctors knew the actual extent of the sickness, and they continued to keep as silent as was possible about any serious future consequences. In spite of the buzzing conversations, there was a balance of optimism throughout the town, and the prevailing thought was that all would be over as the new week began. The ball players were gathered as usual, and the sidewalk tables at the cafes along the Boulevard Gambetta were as full as usual on a Sunday noon. Whether it was at the Bar du Midi, the Café de Commerce, the Bar de Univers, the Rich Bar, or the bar where the club called La Boule Philosophie collected, the drinks were nearly all the same, the selection being limited to the popular pastis. The choice of pastis was multiple: Ricard, Pinaud 45, Pastis 51, or other less famous brands. It would be ordered in many forms, whether with plain water, or in the form of a tomate, pastis with sirop de grenadine, a periquet, pastis with sirop de menthe, or other mixtures, including sirop d'orchard fantasy. In 1951 Scotch had not yet moved in to challenge Provence favorite aperitif. But whatever those at the sidewalk cafes were drinking, their talk was of the sickness gripping the town, either scoffing at it or despairing of it. Mademoiselle Woolschlager passed some of the cafes on her way to the house of her niece and her husband, a young married couple off the village. They were in mourning on this day because the husband's mother had died, and relatives were coming from as far away as Nims for the services to be held that afternoon. The death was a natural one, of old age, and had nothing whatever to do with the illness that was engulfing the town, but hearing in advance of the trouble, the relatives from out of town brought their own bread with them. The lunch that Sunday was one of mourning, the men in their hot, black suits and shoes, the women in equally heavy black dresses. Mademoiselle Woolschlager's niece, serving apricot tarts after the luncheon, noted with bitter irony that the tarts had actually saved them from the scourge in the town. She had gone, she explained, to Grande Rue to buy the pastry and bread for the weekend. Her regular boulanger was M. Bryant, but out of impulse she had gone to a competitor's shop for the pastry and did not dare go then to buy the bread from M. Bryant in the fear that he would notice the pastry and feel that she was disloyal. By this fortuitous stroke of embarrassment she and her family had been saved from further tragedy striking the household. At the luncheon Mademoiselle Woolschlager could not keep her thoughts from wandering back to the pitiful figure of M. Delacroix as he left the office on his bicycle the previous day. With phones and transportation scarce, it was impossible to receive further news of his condition at the moment. There was, it seemed, sadness everywhere in the village. After he had thrown himself on the bed on Saturday afternoon, M. Delacroix felt too weak even to lift his head. The room would alternately spin and stop, then suddenly enlarge to enormous proportions before it would equally as suddenly shrink until he thought it would squeeze him to death. He closed his eyes, but could not sleep. As he did, visions of enormous flowers blossomed behind his closed eyelids. The flowers were not as if he were imagining them, but as if they were actually there in front of him, yet he knew they were not real. The colors were the most vivid he had ever seen, blinding in their brilliance. When he opened his eyes again, he discovered that he had been undressed and was under the covers. He was sweating profusely, yet he was shivering at the same time. He looked at the window and saw that it, too, was enlarging in front of his eyes, encompassing the entire sky with its size until it shrank down again to an infinitely narrow slit. He seemed to have no relationship to time itself and was not aware of what day it was now or of what the others in the household were doing. Then, as suddenly as he felt ill and dizzy and was seized with ivresse, he would be flooded with a feeling of total ecstasy, of a beatitude he had never experienced. He yearned for a pencil and paper to write down a series of glorious insights about the universe that came into his consciousness, then disappeared as quickly. But he was too weak to move, and had no desire to call out for assistance. In spite of the wild and irrational visions and colors that swept before him, the basic core of his consciousness remained rational. He was aware that what was happening was not real, yet what he saw and envisaged had all the attributes of total reality. He knew also that he would fade from consciousness, and was certain that was what had happened when he had been undressed and placed under the covers. He would find moments to worry and fret about their unfinished work at the office, and then when the tides of exhilaration came over him, when the mysterious sense of rapturous benignity swept through him, he felt no concern, no worry, but only the glory of a universe whose meaning he seemed to be seizing for the first time. He could hear vague sounds, vague voices outside the room, and he was conscious that several times Mme. Testovin entered, sometimes with Mme. Lamaki. He was aware that they were changing his sheets, which were drenched with perspiration, softly wiping his forehead, then disappearing quietly out into the hallway. He was aware of them, but could not seem to communicate with them. What M. Delacroix did not know, when Saturday evening came, was that the only people in the household able to be on their feet were M. and Mme. Lamaki, who had eaten the bread they had brought with them, and Mme. Testovin. The latter, who had eaten only a piece of bread no bigger than her little finger, was ill, too, but managed to be up and help with the others by sheer force of will and the fact that she had eaten so lightly. Both Emile and M. Testovin had come in early from the vineyards, exhausted and dizzy. By supper time each had gone to bed, M. Testovin in the large room over the dining room, Emile in his quarters in the farm building adjoining the main villa. Mme Deserses, returning from the village just before supper time, excused herself from the others and retired to her room. M. Testavin already suffered from a weak liver and was convinced, along with the others, that his suffering resulted from the trout. After he got into bed, he told Mme Testavin that when he moved or tried to sit up, his head spun. Emil's complaints were the same. He stated that he felt as if he were very drunk, that the room was going around crazily, and that he was sure he would be all right in the morning. No one in the house yet associated their problems with the bread, and none of the news that was beginning to circulate along Grande Rue had reached La Villette. Saturday evening all through Saturday night and into the early hours of Sunday morning no one in the household was able to sleep, in spite of overwhelming exhaustion alternating with periods of exaggerated energy. Mme Testavin finally dozed off toward morning, after having made many trips to the kitchen during the night to make endless cups of steaming lime-flower tea, known as tilleul. This was another common remedy in the Midi, a common practice for soothing and calming patients, as well as for scenting a baby's bath. At 6 on Sunday morning Mme Testavin woke from her catnap with a start. Strange sounds were coming from the courtyard and she ran to the window to look out. Emil was lying naked in the middle of the yard near the stone washing well, writhing in agony. She swiftly ran downstairs and reached his side. Lamakias, also hearing the sounds, rushed to help her. The three of them helped him into the dining room, arranged a cot for him there, and tried to calm him down. By now M. Testavin was roused, and although still weak, he came down the stairs to see if he could help. The others pleaded with him to return to bed, but he insisted that he was fully recovered, and they must immediately go into town to get the doctor. Before the others could stop him, he was out in the courtyard and mounting his bicycle. He moved off, uncertainly, through the courtyard, moving behind the stone wall and out of sight of the dining room window, from where the others were watching. They did not see him as the bicycle began wobbling crazily back and forth across the road until it shot out from under him and he sprawled across the road just as M. Delacroix had done the afternoon before. He managed to get to his feet and push the bicycle along the stone wall, still out of sight of the others, until he reached the end of the long farm building. There he climbed unsteadily into the truck and drove off down the road toward the village and the office of Dr. Gabbai. Chapter 4. After the dawn meeting with Mayor Hebrod, Dr. Gabbai drove to his home. He arrived there shortly after 6, painfully aware that he would get no sleep this day. At his office window, where he tried to collect his thoughts and organize the day in the face of disorganized chaos that was shaping up all over the village, he noticed the truck of M. Testavin making its uncertain way down the route to Bagnall's toward his house. He watched in astonishment as M. Testavin pulled up by the curb, climbed out off truck, then began crawling on his hands and knees toward the doorway. The doctor's first thought was that he was drunk. He opened the front door just as M. Testavin was climbing up the steps, still on his hands and knees. M. Testavin blurted out the story. Everyone except the two visitors at La Villette was ill. Emil was in very bad condition. M. Testavin didn't care about himself, but the others. Dr. Gabbai, a friend of the Testavins for many years, knew that M. Testavin was a sober man and a diligent one. He examined him minutely at the office, noting that in spite of his illness, M. Testavin was talking in a most euphoric way. He seemed to be on a cloud of unalloyed exultation, while at the same time an objective examination revealed the same nagging symptoms plaguing all his patients in the past few days. The temperature, as expected, was subnormal, the pupils widely enlarged, the pulse slow, the blood pressure low. Along with many other patients now, M. Testavin also had a sharp and biting form of heartburn that would not respond to any usual ameliorative. When M. Testavin said that he had not slept for 2 nights in a row, and that he had moments when he felt the strength of 10 men, interspersed with moments of deep depression, labored breathing, and thoughts that he was surely going to die, Dr. Gabbai nodded in affirmation because these symptoms were now being noted almost universally among the patients. The examination over, the doctor now faced the moment that was becoming more frustrating by the hour. What to prescribe, no word could be expected. Yet from the police laboratory in Marseilles, the symptoms were rare and not clearly recognizable. Each of the doctors had theories, but these could not be confirmed without the laboratory tests, and at this stage of the progress of the epidemic it could only be guesswork. In between the frenzied visits to patients, Dr. Gabbai was painstakingly preparing a chart of symptoms, but there was little to meet or correlate it now. New symptoms seemed to be appearing daily with considerable difficulty. For M. Testavin was a large man. Dr. Gabbai helped him into his own car and left the truck to be taken care of later. He stopped at a pharmacy for some additional medicine in the hope of treating the symptoms before driving out of La Villette. One pharmacy, that of M. Charicentri, bore an ominous sign on the door, Fermi pour cause de maladie. The pharmacists, as well as the physicians, were so deluged with clients that their shops were filled day and night. In France, the pharmacist often assumes the role of a doctor for the lighter afflictions of those in the village, and the current disturbing illness was no exception. Each day, in the regional paper from Marseilles or from Montpellier, a doctor and a pharmacist were customarily listed under the village name for emergency duty during the night. The notices continued to appear at this time as usual. But all the doctors and the pharmacists, except those who were stricken badly themselves, were on call all day and all night, simply because of the overwhelming pressure of the circumstances. Staggering the workload was out of the question. On the way back to La Villette, M. Testavin remained in his state of euphoria despite his other symptoms. He now revealed also a marked increase in the flow of saliva. At La Villette only Mme. Testavin and the guests from Toulon were out of bed. They helped the doctor remove M. Testavin from the car and gingerly guided him up the narrow staircase to his room. Dr. Gabbai began his examinations of the others. Emile, on the cot in the dining room, was writhing in pain and sweating profusely. With the sweating was a rancid odor, an odd mixture of smells, as if it were of dead mice and stale urine. The doctor had noticed this on his visit to Emma Misen. Was this another symptom to be added now to the mélange? He noted convulsive contractions of the muscles, a symptom of tetanus, or epilepsy, or meningitis, or what? Emile's eyes, their pupils swollen in size, looked at him pleadingly. He had not slept for 2 days and nights. Like the others, his exhaustion was great. He moved from weakness to strength in alternating cycles, however, and his strength, when it came, was like that of a drunkard, enormous and uncontrolled. The doctor's problem was that nothing administered seemed to help, even symptomatically. Barbiturates in extremely strong doses were useless to combat the growing insomnia. Morphine, chloral hydrates, or the hypnotic drugs seemed to be equally ineffective. Furthermore, in 1951, post-war scarcities in France were still in effect. Dimly hopeful that this case might be an exception, he prescribed a sedative and then went up to the room of Mme. Deserses. She was on the bed and crying. She, like the others, had not been able to sleep. Her physical symptoms were close to those of others. Although her digestive troubles had subsided, her psychological depression was great and unrelenting. She was helpless when she tried to get up to assist Mme. Testavin, and her sense of guilt about this assumed an exaggerated form, which increased her depression. Unlike the others, her periods of euphoria were brief, even though intense. After prescribing for her, Dr. Gabbai moved on to the room of M. Delacroix. He was on his bed, with a tablet on his knees and a pencil in his hand, writing. He had already filled 1 pad and was beginning his second. Although his mind seemed clear and his handwriting steady, he seemed distant and unrelated to his surroundings. Like the others, he was sweating, so that even now his sheets, which had been changed within the hour, were soaking wet. Again, Theodore of dead mice, strong and overbearing. Again, the low blood pressure, the slow pulse, the wide pupils. In addition to themidriase, the large pupils, Dr. Gabbai noted a new symptom for the first time. The artery serving his left eye was swollen and dangerously pathological. It showed up clearly as the doctor looked at the retina through the ophthalmoscope. The room was sweltering with the heat of the Provençal August, yet the doctor noticed that M. Delacroix was under 3 blankets and still shivering with cold as the sweat poured off him. His extremities were frigid, and yet he seemed to be burning up at the same time. After administering a sedative, the doctor suggested to M. de Laquis that he should stop wenting on the tablet and rest. The suggestion was politely but firmly refused. Down in the kitchen, the doctor asked Mme Testovin if she could get further help to take care of the 4 malades who were depending so much on her. She told him that Mme Lamico was insisting that she stay on to help, and that the Mels Rigord, 2 sisters who lived in a neighboring farmhouse, had volunteered to help in the mornings. Mme Testovin herself had not slept since the trouble began, but her digestive upset seemed to have cleared up and her strength was holding up well, almost too well, in the face of the lack of sleep. The doctor tried to persuade her to get some rest. He knew she would keep the others as comfortable as possible and let him know if any crisis occurred among the 4 patients scattered through the rooms of the villa. He would give every stone of the house, she told the doctor. 1 fee could get them well. The doctor, sagging more than ever with his own exhaustion, patted her on the shoulder and went out to the courtyard and his car. Sunday was always a welcome day at the home of M and Mme Aynard, for their dental office was crowded the other 6 days of the week from early morning until 8 in the evening. As the only dentists in the surrounding area, their work schedule allowed little time for recreation, although they were enthusiastic skiers and campers. They looked forward to the time when the post-war years would gradually bring more professional men into the area so that their time for leisure would be more available. This Sunday, August 19th, brought none of the joy of relief they usually felt. The talk and the rumors circulating around the village were far too disquieting, and the mystery seemed to be growing rather than receding. In mid-morning, someone knocked on the door of their home on the Boulevard Gambetta. It was one of their patients, an elderly woman, who told them that a friend of theirs who lived on the Place de El Hetel de Ville had asked her to let them know that he was very ill, living alone, and unable to cope with the sudden situation. He was an engineer of whom the Aynards were very fond, a technician at the nearby glass factory. M. Aynard lost no time following the woman out of the door and hastening toward the house where his friend was rooming. Passing Grande Rue, M. Aynard noted the exceptional number of people in the streets, all of them talking with an abnormal intensity. "What is it, cher docteur?" a man from one of the groups asked him as he was passing. "Is it what they say? Does it come from the drinking water? Or from the salt? Or the meat?" M. Aynard, who had already talked to all 3 of his medical colleagues, was at a loss as to what to reply. None of the symptoms, he had been told, added up to a clear manifestation of any known current disease. "I'm afraid we will have to await the tests from Marseilles," he told the man. "But how long, doctor? How long must we wait? So many people are suffering." Like every other professional man in the village, M. Aynard devoutly wished that he were able to answer the question. Not since the Middle Ages had an unknown and mysterious malady ranged throughout the village, and the atmosphere was already charged with that sort of feeling. There was no panic yet. The rumors were conflicting and served to neutralize each other. Sot had even the strong suspicion that the source could be traced to. The bread of M. Bryant remained on the same level as the other rumors. No official public announcement had yet been made. That would wait until after the meeting. And perhaps, if M. misunserved, and the symptoms subsided generally, no pronouncement would be necessary. Nothing was moving in terms of rational prediction. The unexpected was becoming routine. Not knowing the source of the trouble exactly, each villager seemed to be developing his own theories. At the bedside of his engineer friend M. Aynard listened to his story. All Saturday night he had been unable to sleep. He had risen at about 3 and tried to read, but the pages danced in front of his eyes. Then a compulsion to walk came over him, even though he felt weak and dizzy. He dressed and went out into the narrow streets of the village. The shadows and the darkness seemed ominous to him at first. He walked down along the Renille the while trying to resist what he felt was a ridiculous impulsito walk. He found himself crossing the entire length of the bridge, then turning and coming back into town, a round trip of over 2 miles. He could not understand his own wakefulness, or his passionate desire to walk. Reaching the Boulevard Gambetta, he was shocked to find Faith was not the only one in the village who could not sleep. Several groups of people were gathered there, standing in clusters and talking ceaselessly. Although he was new to the village, he was welcomed cordially, as if a sudden fraternity had sprung up among the sleepless. They were talking about the sickness spreading over the village, but their talk was predominantly in a most light and frivolous manner. Many were laughing and joking about it. No one felt any desire to go back to bed. One told of a friend of his who had been stricken by the malady and had thrown up for liters of clear gastric fluid. This was found to be most amusing. The ripples of laughter from the groups were forced, high-pitched, and eerie. The whole scene, in the darkness of the early morning hours, was most unnatural. The people were standing in ghostly silhouette under the plane trees, standing as if this were full daylight at the marketplace. Others were walking at random, very quickly, along the streets and alleys, without destination, speaking to no one. He eventually excused himself from the group, returned to his room, and lay down on the bed in a futile attempt to get to sleep. It was impossible. His mind kept inexplicably turning to the thought of potatoes of every size and shape. He was amused at this thought at first. Why should he be thinking of potatoes in the middle of the night, or rather just before dawn? The whole idea was ludicrous, and he found himself laughing out loud about it. But after half an hour had gone by, and he found he simply could not get the thought of potatoes out of his mind, he became desperately anxious about it. It now became a challenge to rid himself of this compulsion, to convince himself of the ridiculous drain of energy this involved. It was only in the early morning, when he heard the cars and traffic in the street, that the thought of potatoes slowly faded from his mind. But now his stream of consciousness was overwhelmed by another idea, an idea that became so overpowering he actually felt was losing his mind. Every time a car or a truck rumbled by in the street below, he was utterly and absolutely convinced that the house around him was going to come tumbling down. It was not a question of this being a remote possibility. He was sure it would happen. He would hear an automobile in the distance. His muscles would tighten. He would clench his teeth almost automatically. Then the sound of the motor would grow louder as the car approached. He would throw his arms over his head and wait for the ripping sound of falling timbers and the crash of the stones from the house. When nothing would happen, he would steel himself again, waiting for the next car to come along. He explained to Aenid that he had not felt sick enough to call a doctor, and he knew how busy they were. He was feeling stronger now, and some of his feelings about the house collapsing around him were fading. Aenid listened and found himself wondering if the sickness was perhaps going to strike him and his family, too. They had escaped any trouble up to now, but the pattern of the disease, whatever it was so unpredictable that it spread fear rapidly throughout the town. He arranged to bring food and wine to his friend and invited him to come to the Aenid house at any time off night or day. Meanwhile, they would visit him regularly and see that care was taken of him. If the symptoms became worse, Aenid would bring the doctor. The engineer had stubbornly insisted he did not want a doctor at this time. Aenid took his leave as a truck rattled by in the street below. This time, said the engineer, I feel no fear. Perhaps getting it off my chest to you has cured me. At home again, the Aenids tried to make sense out of what was becoming a most alarming and confused situation. As dentists, they were professionally aware of many of the medical ailments of the human body, but they could not distinguish any sort of rationality in the puzzle. Francine's sister still doesn't seem to respond to anything, Aenid said, after her husband told her about his visit. She sits there at the kitchen table and stares down at the floor. She won't touch her baby. They are all terribly upset. The only good thing I've heard is that Sauvé is feeling much better. He was so sick yesterday that his wife had almost given up hope. When this first happened, said Aenid, I was sure it was a case of simple ptomaine poisoning. I never thought I'd find myself in the position of wishing that ptomaine poisoning would strike. But that would be a lot better than what we have now. All we need to know now, said Aenid with a weak smile, is when is it going to strike us? All through the day on Sunday, Dr. Gabbai kept in touch with the doctors at the hospital at Nims. The news concerning Maisen was not good. Laboratory tests were inconclusive in attempting to find the cause of the condition, and he was failing fast. The doctors at NIMS faced the same phantom as Dr. Gabbai. It was impossible to treat the disease without an exact knowledge of the cause. The laboratory tests of the bread at the police scientific laboratory would take time. It was impossible to touch them. Many exacting analytical steps were required. M. Meisen was meanwhile receiving treatment for symptoms. It was all that could possibly be done under the circumstances. One theory that was growing in the minds of the doctors, since their evidence pointed to the bread as a source, was a rare disease known as ergotism. It had reached plague proportions during the Middle Ages but had practically disappeared from the face of the earth in modern times. It was not until 1670 that ergot was identified as a parasitic mold growing on rye and wheat under extremely rare conditions. The disquieting thing about ergotism, if this were indeed the disease, is that there is no known cure, even in modern medicine. When he returned from the Testavin farm, Dr. Gabbai's office was full and his phone was ringing persistently. Generally, the digestive troubles were subsiding. In their place was the rising and persistent insomnia. Complaint after complaint over the inability to sleep came from the patients, both those in the office and those in the house calls. Some said they felt such an imminent and overwhelming premonition of death that they panicked during the night. Others complained about sweating so profusely that they had to change their clothes several times a day. The odor of dead mice and of stale urine from the sweat was constant, with the rancid pungency penetrating the household. The sweating was accompanied by an unquenchable thirst. Many felt an overwhelming compulsion to commit suicide. Instead of being disquieted by their symptoms, many of the patients seemed irrationally pleased and elated with themselves and their condition. Their moods would alternate. Some of the patients talked at such a rapid rate that it was impossible for the doctor to understand them. They refused to be interrupted for the simple and basic questions the doctor had to ask. They talked all feeling a grand enlightenment, a sweeping feeling of beatitude and euphoria which only occasionally was broken by spells of anguish and depression. Some were seized by a vicious and agonizing form of heartburn, along with an icy coldness in the hands and feet. The low blood pressure, the subnormal temperatures, the enlarged pupils, continued to show up during the visits. Dr. Gabbai, a warm and sympathetic man, faced the frustration of fighting against the unknown. His sympathies and regard for his friends and patients were being strained to the breaking point by the lack of specific medical treatment to offer. The meeting on Sunday night at the Hotel de Ville did not begin until 9 but continued until 1 o'clock Monday morning. Along with Mayor Hebrod were the entire municipal council, the chief medical officer of the guard department, the 3 local doctors, the local police, the gendarmes, and representatives of the office of the public prosecutor at NIMS. The meeting was grim and quiet. Since no deaths had occurred, there was hope that all would begin to improve within the next few days. As a precaution, however, experts would be summoned from the University of Montpellier's medical school and from the University of Marseille's. The Procureur de la République, as the public prosecutor was known, and the Juge d'instruction, the examining magistrate, would be called in to begin a thorough but quiet investigation in order to avoid unduly alarming the population. Meanwhile, Commissioner Sigurd, a detective of the 14th Mobile Brigade, would begin an immediate inquiry into the facts of the case. More samples of the bread would be taken and rushed to the police laboratories at Marseilles, along with the cadavers of the Moulin and Meisen animals. The results of the initial tests would be pressed with the utmost haste. Some were grumbling that there were too many delays in the investigation. The atmosphere was taut, but there was no panic at the meeting. Only the exhaustion of the physicians, and now of the mayor, indicated the seriousness of the situation. There was still hope that on Monday the tide would subside. There had been meetings like this before in Pont-Saint-Esprit, in the deep past of the Middle Ages, when cholera or the bubonic plague had struck. These had been meetings of panic and terror, when people dropped in the streets and doctors collapsed at the bedsides of their patients. The scene and the backdrop were the same in August of 1951, but now there was modern science with all its available resources to combat the disease. It would only be a matter of time until the laboratory tests would be completed, the cause determined, and the disease conquered. Perhaps, after it was all over, the only inconvenience would prove to be the closing of the bakeries and the eating of biscottes, the hard, packaged rusks in the shape of bread slices, which, of course, could never substitute for the bread by which the villagers lived. At 1 o'clock on Monday morning, when the meeting broke up, Dr. Gabbai walked down the blackened boulevard Gambatato, his home, only 2 blocks away. The shadows of the groups under the plane trees were there, the news of the meeting having accented the inquietude of the insomniacs. The state of nervous, elated excitement was still evident. He knew, without seeing in the dark, what many of their faces were like in this strange state of euphoria, a wan visage, a somewhat waxy tint to the skin, yet with the persistent expression of beatitude. Occasionally, a voice from one group would call in the distance to another. The whole aspect of the village seemed to be changing, daytime habits were becoming those of night. Rarely were the streets of the village occupied at night, even the cafes closed early by habit. Now it was different, as if the villagers were waiting for something vague and mysterious. But the anxiety was not major, it was a waiting, and for what not even Dr. Gabbai knew. Holding back any major anxiety on the part of the villagers was the fact that, while they knew and talked incessantly about the malady striking, and striking often, at least it did not kill. Time after time the phrase would come out among the restless, sleepless groups on Boulevard Gambetta, La peste frappe. La peste frappe souvent, mais Illinois any Tuesday par. Dieu merci. The plague strikes often, but thank God it doesn't kill. In this many took comfort, because the shadow of La peste, the plague, as they were beginning to call it, could fall on anyone anytime apparently. It seemed always to be a matter of who wasto be next. Dr. Gabbai had come to expect his phone to be ringing anytime he entered his house. Returning from the meeting at the Hotel de Ville in the darkness of Monday morning, he found no exception. It was now about 1:30 a.m. Automatically, he picked up the phone, answered it in a voice now becoming hoarse from constant consultations with his patients, 24 hours around the clock. It was Mme Renée Carl, who helped her husband run their grocery on the Rue Joliet-Curie, an extension of the Grande Rue, a short distance away from the bakery of M. Bryant. "Forgive me, doctor, for calling you at this time of the morning," she said. "Please forgive me. But our daughter. She's just 5, you know. Marie Joseph. It's frightening. It's terrible. I just can't describe it." Her voice trailed off in sobs. Dr. Gabbai reached for his bag, which never left his side these days. "T'll be right over," he said. He hung up the phone, and because the Carles were so near, decided to walk the few hundred feet, through the Place de la République, to the Carl home. Other groups of the sleepless were there, standing outside the Café de la Bourse, although its windows were darkened and the chairs piled on the tables. "Any more news, doctor?" asked a sweltering, undershirted man from the group. "None at the moment," said the doctor. "You should try to sleep." "We do," said another. "We do try. My say impossible." "Have courage," said the doctor, and plunged into the blackness of the Rue Joliet-Curie. Joseph Carl and his family lived above their grocery store in an ancient house now neatly restored and not far from the Place de la Libération and the Rue du 15A at 1944. Mme. Carl let him in through the darkened front door of the store and led him along the rows of foodstuffs and up the inside stairway. Dr. Gabbai had already made several calls on the Carl family since everybody, including the femme de ménage, was stricken to some degree. M. Carl was still bedridden but seemed to be improving, even though he had gone without sleep since Friday night. Massive doses of barbiturates had failed to relieve him. As in many of the stricken households, the family had blamed the malady on bad meat. At the present stage M. Carl was listless but wakeful. Every time he tried to get up, dizziness would force him to lie down again. Confined to his room, he was desperate to be at the side of his daughter, but he fell to the floor every time. Hatred from the moment he entered the door, Dr. Gabbai could hear the shrieks of 5-year-old Marie Joseph. When he saw her, the sight was shocking even for a doctor of his long experience. Her entire body was shaking, her arms and legs were jerking in massive spasms, her fingers were clenched until they were white, her toes were bent under so rigidly that they could not be pried open, her eyes were moving wildly in their sockets, and her contracting arm muscles gave her the appearance of a choral director leading a choir. "Mama," she was screaming. "Mama! The tigers! They are going to eat me! They are going to bite me!" Her eyes would widen, then focus on the wall in front of her. "There," she cried. "Right there! Beside the wall! Can't you see them? Mama, stop them from biting me!" There was no question that she was seeing the tigers, which were as real as if they had been there. In another moment she was seeing serpents on the curtains. She was screaming and writhing to get away from them. Dr. Gabbai lost no time in administering sedative intravenously and then methodically going about his examination. Mme. Carl stood by, in tears, stroking the forehead of the child, who was drenched in perspiration. "Mama," she screamed again. "Mama, I am going to die, there is blood dripping from the ceiling." The examination revealed an extreme state of cardiovascular collapse. The writhing and convulsions continued, and so did the hallucinations. While waiting for the results of the sedative, the doctor placed a towel over her eyes, which immediately changed the color of the tigers she saw, but did nothing to remove them. After 15 minutes it was obvious that the sedative had no effect whatever. "There is only one thing to do," said the doctor. "We must call in a specialist from Avignon. They have many specialists for children at the hospital there. They will do everything they can to help." He moved wearily to the phone to call the hospital, but stopped momentarily to see M. and Carl, who was propped up on his bed by his elbows. "Doctor," he said, "I must have the curtains for the doorway with beads on them. You've got to help me get them. For the flies must have curtains with beads on them. Will you help me get them? For the flies. The flies have great need for curtains with beads on them. You understand? They need them. Curtains with beads on them." His head fell back on the square pillow and bolster, his words turning into meaningless mumbling. Dr. Gabbai's exhausted mind began to doubt the sanity of the world itself. What new symptoms were these that were beginning to manifest themselves? Vivid hallucinations in a 5-year-old child. Obsessional compulsion in her father, an idée fixe that had imposed itself forcefully on his mind. He administered a sedative to the father, then went back to the child's room. As the doctor left, M. Carl turned his attention now to the window in his room. There were 6 panes in it, and he began counting them, aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He was not to stop counting them for nearly 3 weeks, day and night, without sleep. In her room, Marie Joseph had suddenly become calm. She was no longer confused and was wide awake and fully normal in appearance. Her blood pressure was improved. She remembered the tigers and the snakes clearly, and seemed to understand that even though she had actually seen them with her eyes in the room, they were not real. She could describe exactly what she saw, but she seemed to realize that they were illusory figures. "I guess it was like a wide-awake dream, Mama," she said. It was hard to tell if her new calm came from the sedative or from a spontaneous recovery. The doctor was inclined to think the latter, for the child was far too wide awake and alert to reflect the effect of a heavy sedative. But under these conditions, he decided to hold off calling the hospital at Avignon in the hope that the sudden recovery might hold. By now Mme. Carl was calmer too, and the doctor left her with instructions to call him at any time if a relapse should occur. Although he longed desperately for sleep, he knew that the likelihood of it was next to impossible. He would make himself some strong coffee when he arrived home, and perhaps he would be able to take a nap in the chair in his office before the next call came. But even this devout hope was optimistic. As he opened the door, the phone was ringing, shattering the early morning darkness with its persistence. He dropped heavily onto his chair behind his desk and answered it. It was the HDPTPT Gaston de Magdenims. Felix Misen, the farmer from Carsan, was dead, all during the days that the doctors of Pont-Saint-Esprit had been without sleep. No word concerning the sickness had appeared in the regional newspapers of Montpellier and Marseilles, the only two papers serving the region. The reasons were varied. The evidence of the extent of the plague, La Peste, gathered slowly and erratically. In spite of the constant gossip in the streets and cafes, most of the villagers felt that the next day would bring better news. Even the doctors, noting a sharp decline in the severity of the symptoms after the second day, were inclined to think that the worst was over. As the evidence piled up, the authorities were anxious to prevent panic and made no official pronouncements. The strange state of euphoria beat was also contagious to a degree, creating an atmosphere of light-heartedness that rode over the feelings of numerous families as they noted the marked improvement of their own malades at varying moments. On Monday, August 20th, only a few hours after Dr. Gabbai had received the news of M. Misen's death, the streets of the village came to life much as on any other day. The strain of the past few days had caused a tolerance for the news of someone being suddenly stricken, and those who did fall ill were now regarded merely as delayed fuses in a disturbing but undulating situation in which good news of apparent recovery seemed to match the bad news of disheartening setbacks. The undercurrent, the murmurs, though, continued. Friends of the Carrel family brought to Granderu the story of Marie Josepha's night, when she had seen tigers and watched blood drip from the ceiling. M. Sauvé, the garagist, had a relapse and was making no progress whatever. He was still unable to get out of bed. Gossip regarding the conditions at La Villette were highly disturbing. Mme Testevin, it was said, was exhausted from trying to take care of 4 patients. A procession of friends drove or walked to the farmhouse with gifts and a first-aid help. But this frequently served to make the situation there more disorganized. The nagging fear hanging over most of the households yet untouched still remained, will we be next? But all this was within tolerable limits of the villagers' endurance. They waited and hoped for better news to break. Just where the first information came from is uncertain. Dr. Gabbai had not announced it, nor had the authorities. It happened sometime in mid-morning. There were no details. The word seemed to strike Granderu, the cafes, the boulevard Carnot, the boulevard Gambetta, the shops, the houses, the vineyards, the ancient hospital, the public washing basins, the post office, the river front, at one single electrifying moment, as if the news were announced from the high tower of the cathedral to the tolling off bells for all to hear. It was not so announced, of course, but it might as well have been. It could be said in one sentence: Le Pain Tuesday. Up until this moment, Gallic resignation had held back real terror, and panic had served as a dam against pressures that had been inexorably building up, but seldom expressed outwardly. Now the single sentence was almost literally on every lip: the bread kills. For nearly 300 families, a sword of Damocles seemed to be hoisted over the thresholds. A stillness and quiet descended, for the 3 words of the sentence were all that were needed to be said. Yes, it was M. Misen, a genteel man who was loved and respected all around the countryside. A man whose dog had died, in pain and convulsions, only a short while before. Clusters of people gathered, by the fountains and in the streets. They were not talking excitedly now. The voices were hushed. Le Pain Tuesday. It was a whisper louder than any shout. Chapter 5. Arriving back from the Arctic, M. Brian found himself wondering, as he had during his visit to his children, why he felt no fatigue whatever after 3 sleepless nights. He was further concerned about his wife, who seemed to be alternately sick and well all during their weekend trip. His daughter Yvonne was the first to give him the news. Early on Monday morning, every boulangerie in the village is closed. Papa, she said, we've been ordered to shut down. M. Bryant was stunned. But why? He said, there is much sickness in all the village, Yvonne said. They think it is our bread that has done it. But that's impossible, Brian said. How could it be our bread? The grey flour from the north came quickly to his mind, of course. But all the bakers had been forced to use it. How would his be different from the others? Both Dr. Gabbai and Dr. View were here while you were gone, Yvonne said. They say that there cannot be any mistake, they are sure now. Within the hour Dr. Gabbai came to visit. It seems your bread is making everyone ill, he said /TT just can't be, said Brian. I use only water and salt and yeast, exactly the same as the other bakers. The flour from the north has been grey, yes. But all of us have been using it. We are doing everything we can to find out, said the doctor, everything. But it is taking time. Is anyone seriously ill? Brian asked. That's what I must tell you, said the doctor quietly. Misen died this morning. Brian sunk in his chair. He dropped his head in his hands. What did I do wrong, doctor? What did I do wrong? The question turned over and over in his mind. He went back over all the details of his 4 knees during the past week. Was this the ultimate climax of the battle with the Union Munir? But if so, why had it not happened before, and why hadn't the bread of the other bakers been involved? All the sick villagers had been traced to his bakery, and to his alone. And then there was Misen. Brian recalled Misen's visit to the shop vividly, the joking and the chiding because he had forgotten to make his delivery in Carson that day. Now Misen was dead. Hundreds of others were sick, including himself and his wife, who was now forced to herb. His daughter Yvonne had eaten only the brioche on that day. She was well. The theory of the doctors was even proved true within his own family. And what about his helper, Pragia? Brian was to learn soon that Pragia was desperately ill also. Within a few hours, the commissaires from the public prosecutor's office in Nims arrived at Brian's door, and the full inquiry began. The tidal wave of panic in the village, as it began, was an enormous swell rather than a crashing breaker. The feeling everywhere was one of being trapped, with nowhere to go, with nothing to do about it. Modern medicine seemed to do nothing. The theory that it was the bread was still not fully established. The feeling that it might be the water or a strange communicable disease of unknown origin persisted. Some quietly packed and went to visit relatives or friends in other villages, unable to stand what they called the agonizing suspense. Others stayed on their farms. The shops were half empty. The doctors were seen in the streets, constantly crossing and recrossing each other's paths on their way in and out of the patients' houses. Every household along Grande Rue had at least one malade. Trucks pulled in beside the grocery stores, where room permitted, and unloaded dozens of cartons of biscuits manufactured in distant cities. The bakeries were shuttered and locked, all of them. By mid-morning on Monday, the men from the 14th Mobile Brigade of Montpellier, the gendarmerie, and the Inspectors Services de Repression des Fraudes had swept into the village, along with the chef de cabinet du préfet du Gard, the chief administration office of the department. They were seen everywhere in streets, collecting samples of the bread from each household, lifting 200 grams of flour from each of the boulangeries and placing the shops themselves under official seal for the first time. Dateline Tuesday, August 21, 1951. The newspaper La Marseillaise published a small news item on page 6. It was the last page of the journal. The headline, Le pain de Pont Saint-Esprit provoked des intoxications. UN mort. In France, intoxication signified poisoning, not drunkenness. Ironically, on the front page a banner headline covered the main story throughout France of the day. The price of bread and bread products was increased by 23%. There was very little detail given in the item about Pont Saint-Esprit. One grave affaire d'intoxication alimentaire à Pont Saint-Esprit provoked des multiples indispositions. Non seulement dans cette commune du Gard, mais encore dans les villages voisins tout au long de la vallée du Rhin. It began. It went on to say that up through Monday, August 20th, nearly 150 cases were being treated by the doctors. The doctors had at that time actually counted nearly 300, and that Misen, age 62, had died in the hospital at Nims. It announced that an inquiry had been opened by the parquet, the public prosecutor of Nims, as well as a judiciary investigation, to establish if all the victims had obtained their bread from the bakery of M. Bryant, who was also himself ill, along with his wife and his helper. The item concluded, actually, the evolution of the disease appears favorable, and it is no longer believed that any further deaths will follow. The brunt of the investigation fell on the cabinet of the judge instruction, the examining magistrate of the Court of Appeals of Nims, M. Perrier. No one could face a more massive or complex inquiry. To be coordinated with a public prosecutor, le procureur de la République, and his deputy, the 14th Mobile Brigade, the gendarmerie, the local police, the local physicians, the minister de l'Intérieur, Direction Générale de la Sécurité Nationale, the medical specialists and toxicologists to be called in, the Laboratoire Interregional de Police Scientifique de Marseille, the local authorities, the officials of the Union Minière, the Ministry of Health of both the Department of Guard and the Republic, the SNCF which had transported the flour in its freight cars, the directors and staffs of the hospitals, some 300 witnesses and principals, and whatever other elements that might be uncovered. The most urgent priority at the moment was the lifting of the samples of bread and flour from the bakeries and the distribution center at Bagnères-sur-Cèze, and the shipping of the cadavers of animals from the farms surrounding Pont-Saint-Esprit, which had died after eating the bread, to the Laboratoire Interregional Police Scientifique. The logistics were not simple. Police swarmed through the town, interrogating the villagers and asking them to dig through garbage pails and trash baskets to find any bread, suspected or not. Each sample was to be carefully labeled and numbered. The corpses of the dogs, cats, and ducks were dumped into sacks to be rushed to Marseille. Some had to be dug up from shallow graves. An autopsy was immediately ordered on the body of M. Amison. Medical clues were desperately needed. His death might serve as a sacrifice for the living. The first step was for the protection of the health of the people. The second was to find out what negligence, fraud, or even criminal action was involved in a plague that was growing more mysterious by the hour. Like everyone else involved in the mystery, the examining magistrate was fighting the same phantom enemy that had eluded the doctors, the patients, and the baker himself. Theories and rumors were everywhere. Those that occurred to the authorities had for the most part already been advanced by the townspeople whose shrewd native instincts were as sharp as those of the experts. Whenever a theory was discussed at the meetings, at the police conferences, in the medical offices, the news leaked out and the rumors took on a new fire, a new sense of urgency, as if the mystery were now solved, and the definitive answer had been found and backed up by authority. And so it was that by the time Monday evening came, their atmosphere among the villagers was charged with certainty: it was arsenic. The sacks of flour, said the word passed from person to person, had been drenched with liquid arsenic en route to the village. Where it came from and what kind of arsenic it was did not matter. The truth, the absolute truth, was that it was arsenic. Everybody who had even nibbled the bread would die sooner or later, within weeks, and there was nothing that medicine could do about it. The rumor spread so quickly, so forcefully, that people went home, gathered their families together, and knelt in prayer. Many sobbed and cried as they came off the streets to bring the news to their families. Hardly anyone knew or would accept the fact that the source of the rumor was an offhand remark by a gendarme, thinking out loud to himself as he collected a sample of bread from a villager. His speculation had been transformed into a pronouncement of unimpeachable authority, yet there was no foundation whatever to it. This theory had already been seriously considered by the doctors at first and by the police and toxicologists later. Arsenic compounds were used everywhere in the vineyards and farms for the treatment of vines and as insecticides. Some of the symptoms of arsenic poisoning had, in fact, been present: low blood pressure, depressed respiration, convulsions. But other symptoms were definitely not present, such as garlic odor of the breath, projectile vomiting with the presence of blood, rapid weak pulse, and others. More importantly, arsenic poisoning is easily traced to during the first days of the sickness. The signs were so variable that there could be as many theories as there were symptoms. By the time the police arrived in the village, the 5th day after the illness had first appeared, the dominant symptom was insomnia. This was almost universal among the victims. Along with the marked dehydration. As the symptoms developed, the doctors slowly realized that the ergot theory, the poisoning from a mold forming on certain grains, was becoming a more logical and distinct possibility, in spite of the fact that historical ergotism was thought to be a thing of the past, a relic of the Middle Ages which had had a few fitful outbursts in the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, but rarely in the 20th. The terror it had provoked in the Middle Ages was of such magnitude that the plague was called mal des ardents, meaning sickness of the burning and the scorched, and le feu de Saint Antoine, Saint Anthony's fire, because only supplications to Saint Anthony were supposed to have had any effect when the tragedy struck. Entire villages had been stricken then with the most horrifying and terrifying madness, and the scenes in the village streets were of unbelievable chaos. Hundreds became psychotic almost at a single moment. Psychic disturbance, a definitive symptom of ergotism, was certainly in evidence now, but the doctors knew that these current disturbances might be ordinary delirium, and besides, they had not shown any indication of appearing in the form of the characteristic major outbreak. Furthermore, the physicians were not at all anxious to announce the possibility of such a rare and mysterious disease. There was no effective method of treatment for it, and they did not want to alarm the population. All that was really known about historical ergotism was that it resulted from an unknown poison of the ergot alkaloid series. 1 Doctor, speculating about the possibility of historical ergotism, mumbled in ironic humor that it would be extremely difficult to treat the disease if ergotism historique were indeed the cause, because the only medical research papers were illuminated manuscripts of the 15th century. He was exaggerating only slightly. There was a more modern and lengthy treatise on the plague written as late as 1887, in the Dictionnaire Encyclopédie de Science Médecine, which described in vivid terms the utter savagery and paroxysms experienced by a village struck by ergotism that resulted from mold on the grain from which bread had been made. The picture painted was not a comforting one. Judge Perrier's first ordinance was a set of instructions to M. Henri Olivier, professor of the School of Medicine of the University of Marseille, and director of the police scientific laboratory there, to determine the cause of the mass illness through exhaustive toxicological tests on the bread, flour, sacks, and viscera specimens supplied by the doctors and the gendarmes. Professor Olivier was faced with an overwhelming job. In its simplest form, toxicology is slow, laborious, and exacting. In the present case, it was to involve up to 300 samples of bread, scores of flour samples, the bodies of dozens of domestic animals, and tragically, human viscera. The sheer job of organizing and cataloging the material was arduous and time-consuming. The number of tests, both toxicologically classical and specific, called for more time than was available if the doctors were to be supplied urgent guidelines with which to work. In addition, each test consumed a considerable portion of an individual sample, so that often there was not enough bulk to the sample to permit all the classical and specific tests necessary to arrive at a definitive conclusion. It was not only necessary to analyze the samples chemically, portions of the samples would also have to be injected or fed to laboratory test animals to observe the toxicity on a living organism. There were no shortcuts. Also, some poisons are unstable and short-lived. Their potency disintegrates rapidly, leaving little or no traces. Bread, especially, dries up very quickly, and with it the important evidence. The pressures on the laboratory team working with Professor Olivier were nerve-wracking. Further tragedy in the village was hanging in the balance. The doctors were working without intelligent information. Time was paramount, but a mistaken or hasty analysis was worse. From the start, the team was unwittingly caught in a vice, and like the others, was fighting against the same phantom of obscurity that had marked the tragedy from the beginning. Olivier took a great deal of pride in his work. Some even felt the pride was excessive. Dark, lean, and intense, the young doctor began the work with the uncomfortable knowledge that the lives of an entire town were dependent on him and what he was able to discover. At the same time, the Office National Interprofessionnel de Céréales, better known as the O.N.1.C, ordered some samples to be sent to the Laboratoire Régional des Subsistances Militaires in Marseille, to conduct an independent investigation and to help expedite the process of trying to discover the elusive cause. In contrast to the Union Municher, the ONIC was a governmental agency which regulated the work of the private corporation. The contract between the private monopoly, the Union Munier, and the government agency, the ONIC, was complex. Even lawyers shuddered at its legal labyrinths. Both, however, were deeply involved in the outcome of the toxicological tests, and both were drawn deeper and deeper into the case as it progressed when the men from the 14th Mobile Brigade, including Commissioner Georges Sigurd, chief of the unit, and Inspector Etienne Vocker, arrived at M. Bryant's shop. M. Bryant was in a state of emotional shock. For over 30 years he had prized his reputation for making good bread. In a single baking, that reputation seemed to dissolve. The flour, la farine, as they called it, had changed without warning from doubtful to deadly. The questioning by the police was polite but harsh. The charges of involuntary homicide were already officially issued against X, and there was no time for more than the barest of civilities. Under their questioning, M. Bryant recreated the entire scene of the night and morning of August 15th to 16th, the borrowing of bread from the other bakers, the preparation and baking of 3/4 knees, the mixing of the various flours, the color and texture of the batter. What other products beside the flour were used? Was anything different used that night of August 15th than on other nights? Were there any insecticides around the shop? Where were the water pipes? There would be more questioning to follow. At the moment the main interest was the shop itself, and the investigators examined every inch of it. Samples of the water, yeast, and salt were labeled and seized. There were no insecticides or fungicides. M. Bryant had never used any other chemicals or materials to fortify his bread, and nothing at all suspect was found in the search. The investigation fanned out quickly to Bagnall Surcease and to M. Bousquet. Only on Monday, August 20th, had the samples of the originally suspected flour been sent to the Union Munier. M. Bousquet had become tired of waiting for their instructions or for a representative to come and collect the samples, as they were required to do by contract. The previous cases of mild illness resulting from the bread sold by M. Ammonia, M. Griotti, and M. Jawson now came prominently to the surface as the investigation broadened. The 17th Brigade Regionale de Police Judiciaire in Limoges went into action in the north to begin their inquiry there. On Tuesday morning, August 21st, another meeting was held at Hetel de Ville in the office of Mayor Hebrard. The three local doctors, not having been to bed for over 100 hours, were literally on the brink of total exhaustion. Strangely, both Dr. View and Dr. Chanak, who had eaten the suspected bread, were able to withstand the strain better than Dr. Gabbai. Their illness had now reached the stage of many of their own patients, almost total insomnia supported by an accompanying unnatural force and energy. An official pronouncement was made for the first time: a collective poisoning, affecting many of the townspeople, has been determined. M. Misen of Carsan has died, others are seriously ill, all the best medical facilities are being put to use to combat the illness. The fears of the villagers were somewhat placated by another rumor that was circulating now along Grande Rue. M. Misen had died from a collapse of the heart and blood vessels, and only the very elderly, who were soon to die anyway, were in any danger. The fact that severe cardiovascular reactions had been noted in victims of all ages was not yet generally known. By evening, Professor Gaston Giraud of the School of Medicine of the University of Montpellier had arrived, along with Professor Cordier of the University of Marseille. A second meeting was held, including the examining magistrate and the assistant to the prefect of the department. It was immediately decided to bring in several interns from the hospital at Nimes to assist the sagging and exhausted local doctors. Professors Giraud and Ricordier would analyze all the data so far collected, as well as examine a large number of patients to attempt a clear diagnosis. The meetings, the analyses of the data, and the laboratory tests were necessary, but they did nothing to correct the situation at the immediate moment. Back at the Moulin farmhouse, Mme Moulin was struggling against the now standard feeling of alternating total wakefulness and total exhaustion. She had not closed her eyes for 4 days. At lunchtime on Tuesday, when her husband and son came in from the vineyards, each was in continued pain and distress. It was obvious that neither husband nor son would go back to work in the vineyards. Every worker in the Moulin vineyards, in fact, was sick, and only 4 of the total of 9 were able to be on their feet. "All my joints pain me," said her husband. "My ankles. My knees. Everything. I must go to bed." Young Joseph was almost doubled up in pain. "I can't go on like this," he said. "I can't stand it." Alarmed, Mme Moulin helped each of them into his bed, brought them infusion to time, and found that she herself was shivering so fiercely that she had to wrap herself in a blanket even though the midday August sun was broiling. After a few moments even the blanket was insufficient. She piled the fireplace high with faggots, lighted them, and huddled close by as the sweat poured from her. Her cold and shivering increased. She piled more fuel on the fire until it frightened her with its crackling intensity. But it did no good whatever. The first of the major convulsions came that evening. Both M. Moulin and young Joseph were writhing on their beds, forearms snapping toward their shoulders, knees jerking upward without cease. Mme Moulin, now so weak herself that she could hardly get out of her chair by the fireplace, struggled to their bedsides helpless in her attempt to keep them covered or give them succor. A neighbor who had dropped by several hours before had promised to get the doctor, but he had not yet arrived. How many hours? It seemed days. Mme Moulin had to wait, she did not know. When the doctor did arrive, he found Mme Moulin crying almost hysterically beside her husband's bed. Both husband and son were racked with convulsions. He ordered an ambulance through a neighbor who had to drive 2 kilometers to the nearest phone, administered intravenous sedatives to all 3, and waited, despairingly, to see if there would be any effect. There was none. When Mme Moulin had recovered some of her composure, the doctor told her, "All of you must go to the hospital. You are too far away here to be taken care of. You must." "But doctor," said Mme Moulin, "there is the vineyard, there is no one to take care of the farm. We cannot all go." The doctor thought a moment, then said, "There is no other choice." Mme Moulin, still shaking from cold and heat at the same time, pleaded with him. "My daughter will arrive here soon. She will take care of the place. Please, can't I wait here until she comes? It will be tomorrow." The doctor assented, but insisted that both husband and son be taken immediately. It took 2 hours for the ambulance from the Clinique Cloy, at Villeneuve-les-Avignon, to arrive. The last words Mme Moulin heard as her son was lifted into the ambulance along with her husband were, "Mother, I think I am dying. My heart is going to stop." Any words from her husband were drowned out by the shrieking of the ambulance as it burst out of the farmyard on the way to the hospitals. Alone, Mme Moulin sat by the kitchen table, her heart wrung with sorrow, her body racked with pain. Again, time went by uncounted, but she did not close her eyes, she did not sleep, and there were no more tears to cry. She was aware, quite suddenly, of the kitchen door opening then closing. There was a doctor standing in the doorway, but it was not her doctor, nor was he one she had ever seen before. He was dressed in a black suit and wore black shoes and a white shirt with a black tie. He carried a black bag in his hand. He was silent, not speaking and not moving. Her eyes traveled slowly up from his shoes to his shoulders, and at last to his head. There was no face there, only a skull, a tête de mort. Their empty eye sockets stared at her blankly. She screamed. The figure of the unknown doctor did not move. She reached for an iron pot lying in front of her on the kitchen table. She hurled it at the tête de mort with all the force she could gather. It passed through the head and shoulders of the motionless doctor and splintered a wooden panel of the door. The pot clattered to the floor at the feet of the doctor, but the feet were no longer there. Nor was the wrist of the doctor, nor the skull. She screamed again, but there was no one around to hear her. She knew that she was hallucinating, but the hallucination was so vivid it might just as well be reality. It grew slowly, what Mayor Hebrid was to call the nightmare that has come to our village. There were signs of it gathering each day and each hour until it arrived. Not even the doctors, inured as they were to the unexpected crises that broke out one very side of them, were prepared for what was going to happen. The villagers certainly were not, in spite of the apprehension, the panic, the sorrow, and the hopelessness. The signs that gathered pointed unerringly in the same direction, but they gave no indication of the magnitude the nightmare was to assume. There had been Mme Moulin and her doctor with the head off death. There had been the tigers and the blood dripping from the ceiling that little Marie-Joseph Carl had seen. There had been the strange compulsion of her father, as he found himself craving 4-bead curtains for the flies to rest on, and counting the 6 window panes in his bedroom endlessly now, for over a day and a night. There had been the young engineer with a compulsion talc, and to think of potatoes. There had been the strange, indescribable colors seen by M. de Lacquis, and the expanding and contracting horizons as he cycled home from his office to La Villette that day that now seemed centuries ago. There was also his compulsion to write, day and night, without cease now. Not all of these indications were known in total, even to the doctors. Not all the cases of dogs, cats, and ducks had been reported, but in 16 villages in and around Pont-Saint-Esprit, the ducks had also strutted like penguins, the cats had screeched, clawed, and drawn their motionless hindquarters along the floor, the dogs had crushed their teeth on rocks, or made senseless attacks on trees until their teeth fell out with the bark they ripped from them. Not all of the animals had died, but many had. These all were separated items, however, not joined in any one tapestry which could be quickly and easily discerned. In hindsight, the panoramic view of all the happenings could be observed in perspective. It is then easy to say, it was all so obvious. Why did it require such a long time to realize the full impact of what was growing? But working under pressure, as the doctors and authorities were, the building blocks of the tragic structure slowly forming in front of their eyes were in fragments. An investigator examined only one brick at a time. The architect's plans and drawings were nowhere in sight. And the bricks, or other individual construction units, were in scattered piles, some hidden, some unrecognizable, some uncounted. And further, there was the element of incredibility. What was shaping up was so hard to conceive that there was a natural tendency to reject the evidence at hand. It was so unbelievable, the psyche could not accept it. And Mme Marcel Boudin, for instance, had no idea what was happening at the beginning. Together, they were proprietors of their combined hat and sporting goods store, enjoying the leisurely chats with their clients, planning someday to move the shop to the wide vistas of the Boulevard Gambetta, away from the crowded quarters just off the Grande Rue by the Place de One Hotel de Ville. M. Boudin, a warm and affable townsman, was also the local correspondent for several newspapers. Knowledgeable and more worldly than the average spirit ponton, he watched the symptoms grow with awe and uncertainty, but also with a journalistic sense of detachment. He agreed with the doctors, as the situation became more serious, that extensive reportage would only contribute to more hysteria and panic, and held back his releases until it was no longer possible. Neither he nor his plump, congenial wife could understand the time when she was overwhelmed with a compulsion to punch him as hard as she could, yet without feeling any anger whatever. One night she woke him up to tell him just that, and together they laughed about it. At length, when the compulsion persisted, he suggested that she let go a series of friendly punches, which she did, feeling better afterward. It became their own private joke, nothing more serious was made of it, and the strange and amusing compulsion soon stopped. There were many incidents like this, happening throughout the village, but neither the doctors nor the authorities were aware of them. They simply remained family jokes in the privacy of the home and were, it turned out, the extremely mild aberrations of those who were lucky enough not to be among the more seriously stricken of the village. Nearly all the people who were to become principals in the drama were reasonably stable and normal folk. Their lives had been no more disturbed than those of any collection of people living in a village and working, loving, and living together along with the common stresses and problems that all life carries with it. Joseph Moulin and his son were held in the greatest esteem in the area. M. de Lacquis was loved by all who knew him. M. Teste de Vin was a tower of strength and reliability. Emil's charm and strength was legendary. M. Carl was a model example of the successful proprietor who provided for both his family and the welfare needs of the community. M. Sauve's sparkling eyes and personality were known throughout the village with affection. M. Misen was particularly mourned because of the love and respect in which he had been held. Charles Pommier, living in the little village of La Motte, just across the ancient bridge, on the other side of the Rhône, ranked with all these in his standing in the community, and was a close friend of Mayor Hebrard. This is why, when he symbolically became the first authentic harbinger of what was to follow, the shock was so great. A 66-year-old widower, he had been among the first to be stricken and hard. He lay on his bed for many days, wakeful but too weak to move. His prostration and insomnia were total, and he was cared for lovingly, but despairingly, by his son and neighbors. On Wednesday, nearly a week after the first cases had been recorded, he lay on his bed, still prostrate, weak, and uncommunicative. It happened suddenly, so suddenly that his son, outside the house in the garden, was momentarily paralyzed with confusion. M. Pommier shot forth from his bed, roaring and screaming, disheveled and demented. He screamed out the window that his enemies were coming to get him. There was foam on his mouth, his eyes were wild and unfocused. He disappeared from the window, as his son ran toward the house. Reaching the front door, the son pushed it, but it did not budge. He pounded on it and begged his father to let him in, but the only answer was more demented shouts and screams. He ran to the back door, but it too was now locked. Inside, his father, shouting that he was being attacked by some unknown enemy, was piling furniture up against the doors and windows. When the gendarmes arrived, he was at his bedroom window, shotgun in hand, brandishing it at the approaching enemy that only he alone could see. The police deployed around the house, keeping out of sight, out of range of the gun. At the window, still foaming and roaring, M. Pommier screamed at the police to come out from behind their barriers and help fight his enemies. The police called to him, telling him to put down his gun, that they would help him if he would do that. Slowly, doubtfully, he lowered the gun, now becoming calmer. With caution, the police drew toward the house, then in a sudden surge moved to the door and broke it in. Chests, chairs, and tables were piled against it. The inside of the house was a shambles. Carefully, the police made their way up the stairs, keeping low and against the wall. The bedroom door was also barricaded. M. Pommier was still screaming that his enemies were after him, that if the police were not careful, they would also kill him again. The inside door was smashed in, the furniture barricade pushed back. M. Pommier was huddled in the corner, away from the window, sobbing quietly. The shotgun lay across his knees. Cautiously, the police approached him. Then, with a sudden movement, he seized a candle, laughing wildly, and began a strange and macabre dance, with awkward, jerky contortions. The police watched, in cautious silence. Then he stopped, stared at them, and sunk down on a chair. Quiet now, he willingly handed them the gun, saying nothing. They straightened the furniture, tenderly put him back in the bed. He did not resist. Then, with wild, loud laughter, shrieking and high-pitched, he screamed, "Oh, tomorrow I am getting married. Do you hear? Do you understand? Tomorrow, I marry. If you wish, you must all come to the wedding." This was the prelude. The harbinger, the second, was an 11-year-old boy. Suddenly, everyone became his enemy. His mother, approaching him to try to calm him down, was abruptly faced with a raging child who hurled himself on her, scratching and pummeling her face and arms. Her husband, helpless and prostrate on his bed, was in the middle of a convulsive fit of hallucinations at the same time. She freed herself, ran for help from her neighbors. Father and son were rushed to Hotel Dieu in the same ambulance. The third flash of heat lightning, before the storm struck, was M. Sauve, the popular garagist, in his 40s, married, and now sick for several days. His wife, administering endless infusions of dried lime flowers, prayed that some kind of improvement would rouse him from his condition of total lethargy and listlessness. The intolerable burning in his stomach and esophagus had diminished somewhat, but the weakness and the lack of sleep were continuing. It was about 9 in the evening when she saw him sit up suddenly in the bed, breathing heavily, muscles and arms flexing, his eyes with their widened pupils staring directly ahead, totally unaware of his surroundings. Then, with an abrupt motion, he seized the square pillowcase and slowly ripped it down the middle. Quickly, he turned to the sheets, the blankets. He firmly pushed her away as she tried to stop him. Taking the sheet first, he ripped it into shred after shred, then the blankets, then he attacked the bedstead itself, pounding it into splinters. All the while, his visage was smiling, pleasantly and confidently, as if this were a delightful and gratifying pastime. Totally unable to stop him, Mme. Sauvé crouched behind the shattered bedstead in hopeless desperation. Sauvé was not aware of that, because clearly in his own perception he was not in his bedroom anymore. He was in the circus, performing the act of a strong man in front of an admiring throng. He was bending iron bars double, as the applause in his ears grew louder and louder. He was ripping sheets of thick steel down the middle, as if they were made of cardboard. He was taking huge timbers and breaking them over his knees. At every stage of the act, the audience, right in front of his eyes, was growing more appreciative. He bowed in modest acknowledgement again and again. As he accepted the roaring applause and prepared to return to his dressing room, he slowly became aware that the audience was non-existent, that it consisted only of his wife, huddled in the corner of the bedroom, in tears. The bent iron bar was nothing more than a ripped pillowcase, the steel plates were the shreds that were left of the sheets, the giant timbers, the splintered remnants of the bedstead. As his awareness returned, he became conscious that all of this had been a wild illusion, and he was filled with remorse. Yet what he envisaged had been so real it might as well have happened. His anxiety arose when he could not explain it to his frightened wife. He fell back weakly on the twisted ribbons of the sheets, wondering what was going to happen next, pleading with his wife to forgive him for an impulse and an event that was as inexplicable to him as it was to her. The cries of M. Sauvé overlapped another outbreak by the little daughter of M. Carl. Again the tigers returned, this time more menacing than ever. While her father lay on his bed, hopelessly and endlessly counting the window panes, he was so gripped by his idée fixe that he could not hear her shrieks and moans. Mme. Carl, halfway between the two bedrooms, could hear both the booming monotonous counting of her husband and the screaming of her daughter. She ran to the child's bedroom to find her thrashing her arms and legs wildly, yelling that the tiger was now at her throat and going to rip her to pieces. So violent was her lashing out that she continually struck her head and her arms on the bedstead and wall, bruising herself badly in the process. The doctor, notified by a neighbor, had already called for the local ambulance before he arrived, phoning the hospital at Avignon to expect the young girl's arrival. What was most immediate was to save the child from seriously injuring herself in her hallucinations. With the help of Mme. Carl, he cut strips of sheeting, and it took the strength of the two of them to lash the child to the bed. There she lay crying out that the blood dropping from the ceiling was drowning her as the tigers were biting off her feet. It began at La Villette with M. Delacroix. For days now, he had lain silent and sleepless on his bed. Mme. Testevin was preparing for another sleepless night herself, as she had for the past week. Things had settled down now into a grotesque routine. In the mornings, with the help of the Rigaud sisters, she would strip the beds of all four of the Mallards, the sheets drenched with sweat and the odor of mice, which still persisted. While the sisters made up the new beds, she would boil the sheets in a huge vat, soak them in eau de javel, take them out to the stone well, pound them and drench them in the clear spring water until they were fresh and clean, then hang them up to dry. Then she would greet a parade of neighbors bringing gifts and food to her to help her in her trouble. But the food was useless, no one in any of the 4 rooms wanted any whatever. They were able to take, at uncertain times, Mme. Testevin's favorite infusion de verveine, an herb tea of her own concoction, or some hot beef bouillon. But each Malade had to be spoon-fed like a baby, unable to help and more frequently resisting the succor she tried to bring them. She had already taken all the winter blankets out of their storage bags, making endless rounds to cover and uncover the sick, as they alternately shivered and sweated in excruciating extremes. Because of the emergency pressures on the village physicians, it fell on her and the Rigaud sisters to administer injections of vitamins for holding back the serious consequences of Themalade's lack of nutrition, and shots of Gardinal in a futile attempt to bring calmness and sleep which had not yet arrived for any of the four stricken persons. By afternoon the Rigaud sisters had left. Mme Testevin remained alone to try to attend and comfort the others. By nightfall she would begin her rounds of the patients, moving from one bedroom to the other, and trying to sleep in chairs in the rooms for brief moments, spending about 15 minutes in each room in an endless cycle. But she, too, had been stricken, and she found she could not sleep, even though she desperately needed to. The sleeplessness had become actually painful now, a burning pain that made the eyes sting and ache with every blink of the lids. This night began as any of the last several nights. She stopped first at the bedroom of M. Delacroix, at the top of the stairs. As usual, he was propped up in bed, tablet on his knees, writing, usually well-groomed. He was now disheveled. He did not seem aware of her entering. She brought with her a tray with another classic remedy, a cup of tisane d'orge, or barley water. Softly she said to him, "You must try to sleep, M. Delacroix, but before you do, take some of this." His eye seemed to come back into focus for a moment, and hesitated. "Have you been able to find me the newspaper?" Every day he asked for the newspaper. And every day Mme Testevin tried to mumble some excuse, because the story of the sickness was just now beginning to dominate the headlines. Only that day they were screaming about the emotion in the village growing hour by hour, that all along the Grande Rue there was panic since the death of Emma Mison, that medicines were useless, that even the strongest were being stricken, as young Joseph Moulin and his father had been rushed to the hospital at Villeneuve-les-Avignon. "Perhaps tomorrow," she told M. Delacroix. "I have not been able to go down to the village for many days." "I would be so grateful," M. Delacroix replied, and he went back to his writing pad. It was filled with tiny, precise script, and each day Mme Testevin had someone bring him a new pad from the village. Without his pad, he became very disturbed. With it, he seemed to achieve some kind of therapeutic sublimation that brought him reasonable calm. She never asked him what he was writing, so delicate was the balance of his emotional state. But she could see that it was for the most part in carefully written verse. In spite of the apparent disarray of his mind, she smoothed his pillows, wiped his forehead and lips with a cool, damp washcloth, left the room, and returned in a moment with a small vase of freshly cut flowers. She kept flowers in every room, and she now arranged these neatly and placed them on a small table below the crucifix on the wall. M. Delacroix had slid back into himself again, writing with the same obsessional intensity he had been demonstrating all day and all night for the past several days. At the doorway she stopped, looked at his strained, thin face and came back toward his bed again. "You could not try to go to sleep?" she asked, knowing from her own sleeplessness how futile the question was. "What if I turned the light out for you?" Lost completely in his thoughts, M. Delacroix did not reply. His pencil seemed to be moving almost automatically along the paper. Mme Testevin, looking down at his fingers, saw that they were red and sore from the pressure of the pencil. "Your fingers," she said. "They are so sore." "Perhaps." He was paying no attention to her and continued to write. She gave up her effort and went out the door and down the tile-floored hallway to the room of Mme Deserses. There was a small light on beside the bed. Mme Deserses, sweat pouring from her face, was lying on her side. She was staring at the wall and sobbing. She had been sobbing day and night, also without sleep, for nearly a week. She would not talk or communicate. The sobs were low and soft, always, but particularly tragic to Mme Testevin because they were so pathetic. She placed fresh flowers beside the bed, again wiped the face of Mme Deserses, automatically straightened the bedclothes, and went on into the Testevin bedroom. Testavin was lying in his bed, on his back, wide-open eyes staring at the ceiling. He had hardly moved from this position over the past week. "He lies like a dead man," Testavin would mumble to herself. He would not respond to anything. She smoothed his hair, washed his face gently, kissed him tenderly on the forehead. He did not move, did not appear to see her, even though his eyes were wide open. This was most painful to Testavin, because it seemed like death itself, with the eyes staring upward, the hands motionless on his chest, the total muteness. "Mon cher, mon cher, mon cher," she mumbled, then went down to the dining room to Emile, now rolling back and forth on his cot, moaning as he always did, day and night. All through the week Emile seemed always in pain, and was completely out of touch with his surroundings. To give him tea or water was the most difficult of tasks, because it would invariably spill on the sheets already wet with the constant sweat that all four of the patients exuded day and night. Emile was the only one who resisted almost any aid brought to him. It became a struggle between the will of Testavin with the washcloth or a cup of tea, and that of Emile, who attempted to avoid them. This night, Testavin noted, was a little easier. He sipped his tea, permitted her to wipe down his face, and dry his sweat. But when she was finished, he went back to his moaning and tossing without cease. Alone in the kitchen, Testavin brewed herself a cup of tea, and prayed for her four malades in the house. With the door closed, she could find at least a small semblance of silence, although from the other rooms of the house came the same sounds that she had been hearing all during the week, a strange orchestration from four different directions. From the rooms of Delacroix and her husband, she would hear only occasional, muffled sighs at rare moments. From Desert's room she would hear the steady, relentless sobbing, which never stopped. From Emile, on the cot in the dining room, she would hear the constant moaning, mostly soft, but frequently loud and intense, blasting the night silence in the large, darkened house. And when Emile's moans would increase, so would the sobbing of Desert's. This was a rhythmic and almost predictable pattern, a pattern she was now accepting as part of a macabre routine which had no end in sight. It was because of her acceptance of this routine that the first signal of something different developing startled her so much. From the room of Delacroix came a sharp, piercing, hideous screech. It was shattering beyond her memory of such a sound. She rushed up the stairs to his room. He was sitting on the edge of bed, pointing wildly to the window.